I survived a catastrophic collision that should have killed me on impact. While I lay trapped inside my own paralyzed body, completely unable to speak or open my eyes, I heard my own children standing over my hospital bed. The doctors told them a single surgery could save my life. My son and daughter looked at my broken body and told the surgeon I was not worth the cost. They signed away my life, eager to inherit everything I had built. They thought I was a vegetable. They thought I would quietly slip away into the dark. But a week later, when they came back to collect their inheritance, they found an empty bed and a letter that turned their greed into absolute terror. My name is Harrison Blake, and this is how I taught my children that you never put a price tag on a father's life. The rain was coming down in thick, violent sheets that night, slicking the Ohio highway into a treacherous black mirror. It was the kind of driving downpour that makes your windshield wipers absolutely useless, slapping back and forth against the glass like a frantic metronome while the world outside blurs into smeared streaks of neon. I am 68 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life as a heavy diesel mechanic. I know machines inside and out. I know the sound of a massive engine humming perfectly in tune, and I know the exact terrifying screech of heavy rubber suddenly losing its grip on the asphalt. I was heading home from the local hardware store, gripping the worn leather steering wheel of my trusty old pickup truck, squinting through the deluge at the blurred red tail lights of the cars ahead of me. I approached the familiar intersection of Route 42. My traffic light was solid green, glowing brightly through the haze of the storm. I eased my work boots off the accelerator, just a fraction, a subconscious habit born from decades of cautious driving and respecting the unpredictable nature of wet roads. But caution cannot save you from someone else's reckless stupidity. The blinding flash of high-beam headlights hit me from the passenger side before I even had a split second to turn my head or process the danger. There was no desperate screech of brakes attempting to stop. There was no warning horn blaring into the night. There was just a deafening, catastrophic crunch of steel folding violently into steel. The sound was so massive, so incredibly loud, it felt like a bomb detonating directly inside the cab of my truck. The raw kinetic energy of the impact threw my heavy pickup across the intersection like a discarded paper cup. I remember the rigid steering wheel slamming brutally into my ribs, driving the breath from my lungs in a sharp gasp. I remember the absolute crushing weight of the airbag deploying into my face, and the sharp, hot sting of shattered safety glass spraying across my cheeks and forearms like microscopic shrapnel. The sharp smell of burning diesel fuel and leaking radiator fluid instantly filled the air, thick, metallic, and choking. My truck spun violently, the crushed metal body screaming and grinding against the wet pavement until it finally slammed to a brutal halt against the concrete barrier of the highway overpass. And then, there was just a terrifying, ringing silence. The rain continued to drum against the crumpled roof, but inside the cab, the world had stopped. My vision blurred into a sea of red and black. I could taste the sharp tang of copper in my mouth. I tried to lift my calloused hands from the steering wheel, but they simply would not move. The darkness rushed in from the corners of my vision, cold and impossibly heavy, dragging me down into a deep, suffocating void where pain and sound ceased to exist. Time completely lost its shape and meaning. I was floating in a dark, formless ocean entirely detached from my physical body. I drifted in and out of a deep medical coma, trapped in a bizarre twilight space where reality and memory bled seamlessly into one another. I could distantly hear the rhythmic, high-pitched beeping of hospital heart monitors. I could smell the sharp, sterile stench of industrial antiseptic and bleach, a smell that always made my stomach turn. But mostly my mind sought refuge in my own past. My brain projected flashes of my life like an old film reel flickering constantly against the back of my eyelids. I felt the rough, familiar texture of the grease-stained shop rags I used to wipe my hands with after a grueling 12-hour shift under the belly of a massive commercial transport rig. For 40 consecutive years, I busted my knuckles open on stubborn bolts. I breathed in toxic exhaust fumes, and I slowly broke my back, lifting heavy transmissions and maneuvering massive engine blocks. I sacrificed my own physical health for one single, unwavering reason. I wanted to build an impenetrable fortress of comfort and financial security for my family. I saw the beautiful face of my late wife, Evelyn. I saw her warm, welcoming smile, the exact way she used to bring me a green metal thermos full of hot, black coffee when I was working mandatory overtime in the freezing, drafty garage during the bitter Ohio winters. Evelyn was the absolute heart and soul of our home. We built a good, solid, respectable suburban life together. We paid off a beautiful 2-story brick house in a safe neighborhood. We made absolutely sure the refrigerator was always stocked full of good food. We made sure our children never had to wear hand-me-down clothes or feel the biting anxiety of wondering how the utility bills were going to get paid. My son Connor is 40 years old now. My daughter Alyssa is 36. When they were young and growing up in the comfort we provided, I willingly worked double shifts and grueling weekend rotations. I missed their little league baseball games and their elementary school plays. Every time I felt the pang of missing a family dinner, I strictly told myself that the extra overtime pay would guarantee their college tuition funds. I wanted them to have soft, clean hands. I wanted them to work in comfortable, air-conditioned corporate offices, far removed from the grime, the risk, and the inevitable physical breakdown of blue-collar labor. I gave them absolutely everything they ever asked for. I paid in full for Connor's expensive business degree at a prestigious private university. I happily paid for Alyssa's lavish, incredibly expensive destination wedding because I wanted her to feel like a princess. But as the years passed and my beloved Evelyn passed away from a sudden aggressive illness, I noticed a distinct and painful shift in my children's behavior. Without their mother there to anchor them to family values, Connor became entirely obsessed with social status and corporate power. He was always chasing the next high-paying promotion, always loudly complaining that his luxury car was not new enough to impress his country club friends. Alyssa grew deeply entitled, treating my quiet, empty home like a free storage facility, and treating my hard-earned bank account like her own personal backup fund for her endless remodeling projects and expensive vacations. I saw the cold arrogance growing in them. I saw the way they casually looked down on service workers and people who made their living with their hands, completely forgetting that those very same calloused hands had directly paid for their privileged, wealthy lifestyles. But I deliberately blinded myself to their flaws. I made endless excuses for their selfishness. I told myself they were just busy, successful modern professionals dealing with the stress of the corporate world. I loved them with the blind, foolish, and forgiving loyalty of a father who absolutely refuses to see the monsters his own financial sacrifices have inadvertently created. The transition from the deep coma back to waking consciousness was not peaceful, nor was it like simply waking up from a long, heavy nap. It was a slow, agonizingly brutal drag back into reality. I became acutely aware of my broken physical body piece by piece. First came the terrifying realization that a thick, rigid plastic tube was shoved violently down my throat, pushing forced rhythmic bursts of mechanical air deep into my lungs. Every mechanical breath scraped against my vocal cords. Then came the overwhelming pain. It was a blinding, white-hot agony radiating outwards from my right leg. My femur had been completely shattered in the collision, and the massive internal bruising made my entire chest feel like it was trapped inside a tightening steel vise. I desperately tried to groan, to call out for a nurse, to ask for a simple sip of water to soothe my burning throat. Nothing happened. Panic struck me like a physical blow to the head. I tried with all my might to open my eyes. My eyelids felt like they had been glued shut, weighed down by solid lead. I tried to twitch my fingers to wiggle my toes, to turn my head even a fraction of an inch against the hospital pillow. My body absolutely refused to obey a single command from my brain. I was completely, terrifyingly paralyzed. But my hearing was crystal clear. I could hear the soft, persistent hum of the ventilator machine standing next to my bed. I could hear the distinct squeak of rubber-soled shoes pacing rapidly across the polished linoleum floor of the intensive care unit. I could hear a nurse adjusting the intravenous fluid bags hanging on the metal pole right next to my ear, quietly humming a familiar pop song under her breath as she charted my vitals. I realized with absolute mind-numbing terror that I was trapped in what the medical field calls locked-in syndrome. My brain was fully awake, functioning perfectly, processing every ounce of the agonizing pain and fully aware of the sterile environment surrounding me. But my physical body was an impenetrable prison. I was a living ghost locked inside a broken shell. The sheer, overwhelming vulnerability of that moment was suffocating. I could not signal to the staff that I was in pain. I could not tell them that I was fully conscious and aware. I could only lie there, motionless, listening to the world move on without me. I heard the heavy wooden door of my hospital room swing open. I heard the familiar heavy footsteps of a doctor approaching the foot of my bed, followed by the crisp rustling of paper medical charts. The nurse spoke, her voice positioned close to my left ear. She reported that my blood pressure had finally stabilized, but she noted with a tone of deep pity that my neurological and motor responses were completely non-existent. The doctor sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound that echoed in the quiet room. He murmured to the nurse that the swelling in my spinal cord had reached a critical stage. He stated plainly that without an immediate, highly specialized, and incredibly expensive surgical intervention, the paralysis would become permanent. He added that if the pressure was not relieved soon, my internal organs would eventually begin to shut down one by one, leading to an inevitable slow failure of my entire system. I screamed inside my own mind. I begged them to prepare the operating room. I told them I was strong, that I had survived 40 years of grueling, back-breaking labor in the freezing cold, that my heart was still beating strong, and that I could easily survive this surgery. But absolutely no sound escaped my lips. The tube in my throat continued its mechanical rhythm, ignoring my internal pleas. I was entirely at the mercy of the people who would walk into this room next. I needed an advocate. I needed someone to fight for my right to live. I needed my family. I clung to the desperate hope that Connor and Alyssa would soon rush through those swinging double doors. I imagined them rushing to my side, holding my motionless hand, weeping for their injured father. I believed with every fiber of my being that they would look the surgeon directly in the eye and aggressively demand that he do whatever it takes, spend whatever it costs to save my life. I waited in the cold darkness of my own mind, enduring the agonizing physical pain, fully trusting that the unconditional love I had poured into my children for 4 decades would be my ultimate salvation. I lay there trapped in silence, completely unaware that the people I trusted most in this world were about to deliver a betrayal far more devastating than the collision that had shattered my bones. I lay in the sterile darkness of my own mind. Every second felt like an eternity. The ventilator forced air into my lungs with a heavy mechanical hiss. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only proof I was still alive. Then I heard the sound I had been praying for since the collision. The heavy intensive care doors swung open. I heard the familiar sharp click of expensive leather dress shoes. That was Connor. Right behind him was the rapid clicking of high heels. That was Alyssa. My children had arrived. A massive wave of emotional relief washed over my paralyzed body. My heart monitor must have beeped a little faster. I could not open my eyes to see their faces, but I could picture them perfectly. Connor with his tailored suits and perfectly combed hair. Alyssa with her designer bags and polished nails. I had worked 40 years under grease-covered diesel trucks, so they could wear those clothes. Now they were here to save me. I waited for the warmth of my son holding my calloused hand. I waited for the soft tears of my daughter falling on my cheek. I waited to hear their voices filled with panic and deep love. Instead, I heard Connor sigh loudly. He complained about the smell of the hospital and how the valet parking attendant scratched the paint on his imported luxury sedan. Alyssa muttered that her expensive shoes were getting completely ruined on the sticky linoleum floor. Not a single word of sorrow, not a single tear, just absolute annoyance. My heart sank slightly, but I made desperate excuses for them. I told myself they were just in shock. People handle sudden trauma in strange ways. They were scared for their father. They just did not know how to express it yet. The privacy curtains rustled. A new set of heavy footsteps approached the side of my bed. It was the lead trauma surgeon. His voice was deep and exhausted. He introduced himself to Connor and Alyssa. I listened with desperate hope, waiting for the doctor to tell my children exactly how to fix me. The surgeon did not waste any time. He explained the catastrophic damage from the highway collision. He detailed my shattered right femur and the massive internal hemorrhaging that was currently threatening my organs. But then his voice grew incredibly serious. He told them the real crisis was my spine. The violent impact had caused a severe compression in my cervical vertebrae. He explained that without immediate surgical intervention, the extreme pressure would permanently sever the delicate nerve pathways. He said the swelling would slowly shut down my internal organs one by one until my heart simply stopped beating altogether. There was a long, agonizing silence in the room. Then the surgeon offered the ultimate lifeline. He said there was an emergency experimental surgery that could relieve the spinal pressure and fuse the broken vertebrae. It was a highly specialized procedure performed by a top-tier neurosurgeon who had just arrived in the state. The doctor said if they moved fast, I had a very strong chance of a full recovery. I felt a massive surge of joy inside my paralyzed chest. I was going to live. I was going to walk out of this hospital and see the sun again. But then the surgeon dropped the heavy truth. The procedure was considered highly experimental by my insurance provider. It was completely out of network. The insurance company would only cover a very small fraction of the exorbitant cost. The out-of-pocket expense would be absolutely astronomical. It would require a massive immediate down payment to secure the surgical team and the specialized medical equipment. The doctor looked at my children and told them they needed to make a massive financial commitment right now to save my life. I waited for Connor to instantly agree. I waited for my successful corporate son to tell the doctor that money was no object. I expected them to say they would drain their savings accounts, remortgage their sprawling suburban homes, and do absolutely whatever it took to keep their father alive. Instead, Connor loudly cleared his throat. He asked the doctor if they could have a moment to discuss the finances privately. The surgeon agreed and stepped away down the hall. Connor and Alyssa walked toward the door of my room. They stepped just outside into the hallway, but they left the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. They thought I was a vegetable. They thought my brain was as dead and broken as my body. They had no idea my hearing was perfectly sharp. Every single word they whispered echoed directly into my ears like a physical blow from a heavy iron hammer. Connor spoke first. His voice was low and dripping with intense irritation. He said the cost of the surgery was completely absurd. He told his sister that dropping that kind of cash right now would entirely derail his personal finances. He said he was exactly 1 week away from paying the massive initiation fee for an exclusive executive country club. He explained that this membership was absolutely crucial for his corporate networking and his upcoming promotion to regional director. He actually said out loud that his career trajectory and his golf games were more important than an experimental surgery on an old man. He said I might never walk the same again anyway, so it was a terrible return on investment. I lay there completely frozen in the dark. My brain could not process the absolute evil of his words. This was the little boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the park. This was the son whose expensive private college tuition I paid for in full by working grueling 80-hour weeks in the freezing snow. I had spent years breathing in toxic diesel fumes so he could sit in an air-conditioned office. Now he was trading my entire existence for a country club membership. Alyssa chimed in next. I prayed my little girl would be the voice of reason. I prayed she would scream at her brother and demand they use their wealth to save me. I remembered paying for her lavish destination wedding just a few years ago without a single complaint because I wanted her to be happy. But her words were even colder and more calculating than her brother's. Alyssa whined that she was right in the middle of a massive high-end kitchen remodel. She complained that she had already ordered custom-imported Italian marble countertops and top-of-the-line luxury appliances. She told Connor that if she had to contribute a single dime to my medical bills, the expensive contractors would walk off the job and her beautiful house would be a total disaster for the upcoming holiday season. She said she simply could not pause her perfect life for a surgery that was not even guaranteed to work. She called me a financial burden. She said I had lived a long enough life and that spending hundreds of thousands of dollars just to give me a few more miserable years in a wheelchair was a terrible financial decision for their future inheritances. I felt a cold, suffocating darkness wrap completely around my soul. The physical agony of my shattered bones was absolutely nothing compared to the violent tearing of my heart, my own flesh and blood. The children I had loved with every fiber of my being. They were standing 10 feet away, negotiating the price of my life and deciding I was simply not worth the trouble. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to sit up in that bed, tear the mechanical breathing tube from my throat, and banish them from my sight forever. But I was trapped. I was a helpless prisoner inside my own failing body, forced to listen as the two people I loved most in the entire world casually planned my execution over kitchen renovations and golf memberships. They finished their terrible math in the hallway. I heard their expensive shoes clicking against the floor as they re-entered the room. They walked casually back to the foot of my hospital bed. The trauma surgeon returned a moment later. He asked them gently if they had reached a decision, reminding them that the critical window for the spinal surgery was closing very rapidly. Connor spoke with a smooth, practiced corporate voice. He sounded exactly like a middle manager declining a bad business proposal. He looked the exhausted doctor in the eye and said the words that will haunt my memory until the day I take my final breath. He said it is his problem. We do not owe him anything. Let nature take its course. The cold words hung heavily in the sterile hospital air. The doctor was clearly taken aback by their absolute lack of empathy. He reminded them with a shaky voice that without the surgical intervention, the swelling would crush my spinal cord, and I would inevitably suffocate and pass away within days. Alyssa let out a fake, dramatic sigh. She looked at my motionless body and told the doctor that it was simply God's will. She said they had decided against any heroic medical measures because I would not want to be a burden on my family. They opted for minimal comfort care only. The doctor, bound by their strict legal authority as my next of kin, solemnly produced the heavy medical paperwork. I heard the crisp rustling of the pages being flipped on the clipboard. I heard the sharp scratch of the ink pen against the paper. Connor and Alyssa cheerfully signed a "do not resuscitate" order. They officially signed my death warrant without shedding a single tear. They legally instructed the hospital medical staff to stand back and let me die. The surgeon left the room, his footsteps heavy with quiet disgust and profound sorrow. Connor and Alyssa stood by my bed for just a few minutes longer. They did not step forward to hold my hand. They did not lean down to whisper any final words of love or comfort into my ear. Instead, they immediately shifted their focus to the money and the property they were about to inherit. Alyssa crossed her arms and asked Connor how quickly they could get my beloved suburban house on the real estate market. She noted with excitement that the current housing market was incredibly hot, and a quick cash sale would easily cover her remaining kitchen remodel costs and leave plenty of extra spending money for a luxury ski trip to Europe. Connor casually agreed, mentioning that they should also quickly liquidate my vintage truck collection and empty my personal checking accounts before the probate court tied everything up in legal red tape. They stood over my broken, paralyzed body and appraised my entire life's work like a cheap weekend yard sale. They laughed softly together about how incredibly convenient it was that I kept the house in such pristine condition, making it easier for them to flip for a massive profit. Then, without a single backward glance or a moment of hesitation, they turned around and walked out of the intensive care unit. The heavy double doors swung shut behind them, sealing me inside the quiet, terrifying darkness of the hospital room. The rhythmic hissing of the ventilator was the only sound left. I was left completely alone, trapped inside a paralyzed shell, sentenced to a slow and agonizing death by the very children I had sacrificed my entire life to protect. The absolute betrayal burned through my veins, replacing my profound grief with an intense, icy fury. They thought I was a broken old man who would just quietly fade away into the night so they could collect their unearned inheritance. They had no idea that their monstrous greed had just awakened a relentless determination deep inside my soul. They thought I was finished, but my fight for absolute justice had only just begun. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, and the absolute finality of that sound echoed through the darkest corners of my mind. I was entirely alone in the sterile, suffocating silence of the intensive care unit. For the first few minutes, a crushing, suffocating wave of grief threatened to drown me completely. My own children, the boy and girl I had hoisted onto my shoulders, the children I had sacrificed my own body to protect and provide for, had just coldly calculated the monetary value of my existence and decided I was simply not worth the investment. I felt a profound, agonizing sorrow clawing at my chest, a pain far more excruciating than the shattered femur or the battered ribs that currently trapped me in this bed. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent under leaking diesel engines, the freezing Ohio winters, where my hands cracked and bled, all so Connor could have his pristine college tuition and Alyssa could have her perfect suburban wedding. They had taken every single drop of my sweat and blood, and in return, they had signed a piece of paper instructing the hospital staff to let me suffocate and die. But as the long, agonizing hours of the night dragged on, that paralyzing sorrow began to shift. The crushing weight of the grief slowly calcified, transforming into something entirely different. It turned into a pure, white, hot, resolute fury. I realized I was not mourning the children who had just left my room. I was mourning a fictional version of them that I had foolishly invented in my own head. The real Connor and Alyssa were shallow, greedy, and utterly devoid of a soul. They thought I was a broken, senseless vegetable. They thought I would quietly and obediently slip away into the permanent dark, so they could quickly list my family home and fund their luxury vacations and country club memberships. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of their betrayal ignited a massive, violent surge of adrenaline deep within my core. It was a biological fire, a primal refusal to be discarded like useless scrap metal. I focused every single ounce of my remaining willpower on my right hand. The doctor had said the swelling in my spine was cutting off the nerve pathways, but I refused to accept that as my final diagnosis. I was a master mechanic. I had spent 4 decades diagnosing and bypassing broken systems, and I was going to force my own neurological wiring to reconnect. I lay completely motionless, the mechanical ventilator hissing rhythmically, pushing air into my lungs, while I fought the greatest battle of my entire life inside my own head. I isolated my thoughts, directing all my mental energy down the length of my right arm. I imagined the electrical signals traveling from my brain, pushing desperately past the bruised and battered vertebrae in my neck, fighting through the dark, disconnected void. Midnight passed. The hospital corridor grew quiet, punctuated only by the occasional squeak of a nurse's rubber shoe. The physical exertion of trying to move a single muscle while trapped in locked-in syndrome was absolutely exhausting. My internal temperature spiked. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead, but I did not stop. I thought about Alyssa, whining about her imported Italian marble countertops. I thought about Connor treating my life like a bad business investment. The rage burned hotter, fueling the adrenaline that coursed through my veins. Around 3 a.m, after hours of agonizing, relentless mental strain, I felt a tiny microscopic spark of sensation in my right index finger. It was nothing more than a faint prickle, like a sleeping limb slowly waking up, but it was the most beautiful feeling I had ever experienced. I seized upon that tiny spark. I poured every memory of my late wife, every ounce of my remaining strength into that single finger. I pushed and pushed against the invisible barrier until finally I heard the faint, distinct sound of my fingernail scraping against the coarse fabric of the hospital blanket. I had moved. I had broken the absolute paralysis. Emboldened by this microscopic victory, I shifted my focus to my eyelids. They felt like they were forged from solid lead, sealed shut by the trauma of the impact. I fought against the heaviness, channeling the raw, furious adrenaline that was now flooding my system. Slowly, agonizingly, my eyelashes fluttered. The blinding, harsh glare of the fluorescent hospital lights pierced my vision, burning my retinas, but I kept my eyes wide open. I was awake, I was alive, and I was absolutely furious. By the time the morning shift change occurred, I had managed to regain limited shaky control over my arms and my facial muscles. The swelling in my spine must have shifted just enough, aided by the massive influx of adrenaline to temporarily open the blocked neural pathways. The door to my room opened, and a young morning nurse stepped inside, carrying a clipboard and a fresh bag of intravenous fluids. She walked casually to the side of my bed, humming a quiet tune, entirely expecting to find the same unresponsive, comatose patient from the night before. As she reached out to check the monitor wires taped to my chest, I slowly raised my trembling right hand and grabbed her wrist. The nurse gasped loudly, dropping the plastic fluid bag onto the linoleum floor with a sharp smack. Her eyes went wide with absolute shock as she looked down and saw my eyes fully open, staring directly into hers with an intense, burning clarity. She immediately reached for the emergency call button on the wall, her voice trembling as she started to yell for the attending physician. I squeezed her wrist as hard as my weakened muscles would allow. I needed her to stop. I needed to control the situation before my greedy children were notified that their impending inheritance had just woken up. The trauma surgeon rushed into the room a moment later, looking completely astounded. Seeing me awake and responsive, he immediately ordered the respiratory team to carefully remove the mechanical breathing tube from my throat. The extubation process was incredibly uncomfortable, leaving my vocal cords feeling like they had been scrubbed with rough sandpaper. I coughed violently, taking my first independent, ragged breath of hospital air. The doctor shined a small pen light into my eyes, murmuring in disbelief about spontaneous neural recovery and reduced spinal inflammation. He told me it was an absolute miracle, but he warned me that my spine was still in critical danger, and the experimental surgery was still absolutely necessary for my long-term survival. He told the nurse to immediately contact my son and daughter to share the miraculous news. I forced my raw, burning throat to work. My voice came out as a harsh, gravelly whisper, but the tone was absolute steel. I looked the doctor dead in the eye and commanded him not to call my children. I told him that under no circumstances were Connor and Alyssa to be notified of my recovery. The surgeon looked deeply confused, reminding me that they were my legal next of kin and my medical proxies. I took a painful, shuddering breath and explained exactly what I had heard the night before. I told the medical staff how my own flesh and blood had casually debated the financial cost of my life. I told them about the country club membership and the kitchen remodel. I told them how my children had eagerly signed the Do Not Resuscitate order, hoping I would suffocate in the dark so they could quickly flip my house for cash. The young nurse covered her mouth in sheer horror, her eyes filling with empathetic tears. The older trauma surgeon stood perfectly still, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal profound disgust. He had seen many family tragedies in the intensive care unit, but the calculated, monstrous greed of my children clearly sickened him. I looked at the doctor and told him that if he called them, they would simply find another legal loophole to ensure I did not receive the care I needed. I asked him to grant me just a few hours of absolute secrecy to arrange my own affairs. The surgeon, moved by the grim reality of my situation, silently nodded his agreement. He instructed the nurse to keep my status strictly off the main electronic hospital registry for the morning, officially classifying my room as restricted. The nurse gently handed me the hospital telephone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the numbered buttons, but I knew exactly who I needed to call. I dialed the number of Tom Miller. Tom was my late wife, Evelyn's older brother. He was a man carved directly from solid oak, a stubborn, unyielding retired Ohio State trooper who had spent 30 years working massive highway pileups and dealing with the absolute worst of human nature. Tom and I had always been close. We shared a mutual silent respect, born from decades of working hard, honest jobs. When Evelyn passed away, Tom was the only one who truly understood the depth of my quiet grief. The phone rang 3 times before his gruff, commanding voice answered. I forced the words past my bruised vocal cords. I said his name, telling him it was Harrison and that I was in severe trouble and needed him at the hospital immediately. Tom did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply asked for my room number and told me he was on his way. Less than 40 minutes later, the heavy door to my room swung open. Tom marched in wearing his heavy leather boots, a faded flannel jacket, and a face like a looming thundercloud. When he saw my battered, bruised body lying in the hospital bed, his stern expression softened into genuine brotherly concern. He pulled a plastic chair close to my bed and sat down heavily. I did not waste any time. I told Tom the entire ugly truth. I recounted the catastrophic accident, the agonizing hours of locked-in paralysis, and the devastating conversation I had been forced to listen to. I watched Tom's strong jaw clench tighter and tighter as I repeated Connor's complaints about his precious country club fees. I saw the absolute cold fury ignite in Tom's eyes when I told him about Alyssa prioritizing her imported marble countertops over my beating heart. By the time I explained how they cheerfully signed the order to let me die, Tom's large calloused hands were balled into tight fists, resting on his knees. Tom took a deep, steadying breath, his police training kicking in to suppress his outrage. He looked at me with a gaze so fiercely loyal, it brought a sudden sting of tears to my tired eyes. He told me that Connor and Alyssa were no longer my blood. He said they were nothing more than greedy strangers, and we were going to treat them exactly as such. I told Tom that the surgeon had warned me I still desperately needed the expensive spinal fusion, but I absolutely refused to stay in a hospital where my children held legal proxy over my medical decisions. I told him I needed to get out of this facility today against medical advice if necessary, so I could secure private care on my own terms. Tom immediately sprang into action. During his decades on the highway patrol, he had built a massive network of reliable contacts. He stepped into the hallway and made a series of rapid, hushed phone calls. Within 20 minutes, he returned to my bedside and informed me that he had contacted a highly reputable private medical transport company run by a former paramedic he trusted with his life. The transport team was already en route with a specialized spine board and an onboard physician to safely move me to an exclusive private orthopedic surgical center 3 towns over, completely out of the jurisdiction of my children's influence. The hospital administration understandably pushed back. The trauma surgeon warned us of the severe risks of moving a patient with a compromised cervical spine. But Tom stood his ground like a brick wall, fiercely advocating for my right to discharge myself. I signed the against medical advice forms with a violently trembling hand, legally assuming all the risks of my departure. I did not care about the physical danger. I knew that staying in that bed waiting for my children to return and finish the job they started was a far greater threat to my survival. Before the private transport team arrived to move me onto the rigid stretcher, I asked the young nurse for a blank sheet of paper and a black ink pen. Propped up slightly by the hospital pillows, fighting through the agonizing pain radiating down my shattered leg and up my neck, I gripped the pen. My handwriting was messy, jagged, and completely unlike my usual steady script, but the words I wrote were as sharp and unyielding as broken glass. I wrote a single devastating paragraph addressed directly to Connor and Alyssa. I wrote that I had been awake in the dark. I wrote that I had heard every single word of their cold, calculated transaction. I told them I heard them price my life against their luxury vacations and their status symbols. I wrote that they had eagerly signed away my existence to inherit a fortune they had done absolutely nothing to earn. I finished the letter by telling them that my hospital bed was empty, and as a direct result of their monstrous greed, their future would be equally barren. I did not sign it with love. I simply signed my name, Harrison Blake. I asked Tom to take a piece of clear medical tape from the nurse's cart. With careful precision, Tom taped the folded letter directly to the center of my sterile, empty hospital pillow. It sat there like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the vultures to return. A few moments later, the private transport team wheeled a heavy gurney into the room. They carefully transferred my broken body onto the secure spine board, strapping me down tight to prevent any further damage to my neck. As they wheeled me out of the room down the service elevator and out toward the loading dock, where the rain was still falling steadily from the gray Ohio sky, I felt a strange, profound sense of liberation. My heart was broken by the loss of the children I thought I knew, but my mind was completely clear. I was escaping the brink of death, not just to survive, but to meticulously dismantle the entitled lives my children thought they were about to enjoy. They had left me to die in that room, but I was rolling out into the storm, carrying a silent, unstoppable storm of my own. I spent the first few days of my escape hidden away in the secluded guest room of Tom's rural cabin. The physical pain of my shattered femur and bruised ribs was absolutely excruciating. Every single time I took a deep breath, my chest felt like it was wrapped in burning iron bands. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the cold, hard reality settling into my heart. My own children had happily left me to suffocate in a hospital bed. I sat in a heavy wooden wheelchair, wrapped in thick blankets, staring out the window at the heavy Ohio rain. I was grieving the death of the family I thought I had built. Tom walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. He set one down on the small table next to my wheelchair and pulled up a chair beside me. He did not offer empty sympathy. Tom was a retired state trooper, and he knew that false comfort did not heal real wounds. Instead, he opened a silver laptop and placed it squarely on his knees. He looked at me with his steely gray eyes and told me that during his 30 years on the highway patrol, he learned that you always need irrefutable proof of a criminal's intent. He said that greedy people always reveal their true nature when they think nobody is watching. Tom explained that right before the private medical transport team wheeled me out of the intensive care unit, he had slipped a small tactical recording device behind the metal grate of the air conditioning vent directly above my hospital bed. He had synced the hidden camera to a private cloud server. He wanted to capture the exact moment my children returned to the hospital to claim their unearned inheritance. He wanted me to see with my own 2 eyes exactly who Connor and Alyssa truly were, so I would never second-guess my decision to cut them out of my life. I held the warm coffee mug in my trembling hands and nodded. Tom opened the video file and pressed play. The timestamp on the bottom corner of the screen indicated it was exactly 1 week after the catastrophic collision that nearly took my life. The hospital room looked incredibly sterile and cold. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated the bare mattress where I had suffered in locked-in paralysis just a few days prior. The heart monitors were pushed against the far wall and turned completely off. The room was perfectly silent. Then the heavy wooden door swung open. I watched the screen intently as my son Connor and my daughter Alyssa walked into the room. They were dressed in impeccable faux mourning attire. Connor wore a tailored black suit with a crisp white shirt and a dark silk tie. Alyssa wore an expensive black designer dress and large dark sunglasses. They had clearly put on a spectacular performance for the nurses at the front desk. I could see Alyssa holding a crumpled tissue to her face, pretending to dab away tears of profound grief as she crossed the threshold. Connor held his hand on her shoulder, playing the role of the strong, supportive brother, comforting his devastated sister. But the very second the heavy hospital door clicked shut behind them, the entire theatrical performance instantly vanished. Alyssa forcefully threw her tissue into the trash can. She pulled off her dark sunglasses and shoved them into her expensive leather purse. Her face held absolutely no sorrow. Connor loosened his silk tie and let out a loud, irritated sigh. He checked his luxury silver wristwatch and loudly complained that the hospital valet service was incredibly slow. I stared at the laptop screen, unable to blink. These were the children I had sacrificed my entire physical body to protect. I had spent 40 years of my life freezing in open-air garages, busting my knuckles on heavy diesel engines just so they could have soft lives. I had paid for every single luxury they currently wore. And now, they were standing in the very room where they thought their father had slowly died, complaining about parking attendants and tight schedules. Alyssa paced the floor of the room. She complained that the hospital coffee tasted like dirty water and that she had a massive headache from dealing with the legal paperwork downstairs. She turned to Connor and asked him how quickly they could get the death certificate officially signed by the lead trauma surgeon. She said her kitchen contractors were demanding the next massive cash installment for her imported Italian marble countertops, and she needed my bank accounts legally unfrozen by tomorrow afternoon. Connor nodded and told her to calm down. He said the probate lawyers were already on standby. He confidently explained that since they were my legal next of kin and had signed the do not resuscitate order, The hospital would process the death certificate as a standard formality. He said they would take the document straight to my bank and liquidate my personal checking and savings accounts before the end of the business day. He also proudly mentioned that he had already contacted a prominent local real estate agent to list my beautiful suburban home for a quick cash sale. He said he needed his half of the property money to pay the initiation fee for his exclusive executive country club by the end of the month. They stood there casually dividing up the literal value of my life. They treated my decades of grueling, back-breaking labor like a winning lottery ticket they had just scratched off. Then, Alyssa stopped pacing. She finally looked directly at the center of the room. She frowned and pointed her manicured finger at the hospital bed. The bed was completely flat. The thick blankets and medical sheets had been completely stripped away, leaving only the bare, sterile mattress. She looked at Connor and asked him why the bed was empty. She asked if the nurses had already moved my body to the morgue in the hospital basement. Connor casually shrugged his shoulders. He said it made perfect sense that they would move the body quickly to free up a valuable intensive care room for the next paying patient. He smiled and said it was actually much better this way because they would not have to stare at a depressing corpse while they waited for the doctor to bring the final paperwork. He turned his back to the bed and started typing on his expensive cellular phone, probably sending emails to his country club buddies. But Alyssa stepped closer to the bare mattress. The high-definition camera captured the exact moment her eyes locked onto a crisp white envelope sitting dead center on the foot of the bed. It was the letter I had written with my violently trembling hands right before I escaped. Tom had taped it securely to the mattress, so it could not be accidentally swept away by the cleaning staff. Alyssa reached out and pulled the tape free. She picked up the envelope. I watched her read the front of the paper. She recognized my messy, jagged handwriting immediately. She called out to her brother. Her voice sounded slightly confused, but mostly just curious. She told Connor that there was an envelope left on the bed, and it had both of their names written on it. Connor put his phone away and walked over to his sister. He looked at the envelope and scoffed. He confidently assumed it was just some old sentimental note I had written years ago that the nurses had somehow found in my wallet. He reached out and snatched the envelope from her hands. He aggressively tore the top of the paper open and pulled out the single sheet of stationery inside. I held my breath in the quiet cabin. Tom leaned forward in his chair, watching the screen with absolute fierce intensity. We watched Connor unfold the letter. We watched his arrogant, confident eyes scan the first line of my jagged handwriting. I knew exactly what the letter said, because those words were permanently burned into my own soul. I had written to them that I did not die in the dark. I wrote that I was wide awake and trapped inside my paralyzed body, while they stood 10 feet away and debated the financial cost of my survival. I told them I heard every single word of their cold, calculated transaction. I told them they had priced my beating heart against their luxury vacations and their trivial status symbols. I wrote that they had eagerly signed away my existence to inherit a fortune they had done absolutely nothing to earn. I finished the letter by telling them that my hospital bed was empty, and as a direct result of their monstrous greed, their future would be equally barren. The physical transformation of my son was instantaneous and absolute. The healthy color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. His mouth fell open, and his hands began to shake so violently that the paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. He stopped breathing. He simply stared at the paper, as if it had suddenly caught fire in his hands. Alyssa saw his face and instantly panicked. She grabbed his arm and asked him what the letter said. She asked him what was wrong. Connor could not form a complete sentence. He simply handed the letter to his sister and took 2 heavy steps backward away from the bed. Alyssa read the letter out loud. Her voice started as a confused whisper, but as she read the words I had written, her tone escalated into a shrill, terrified shriek. She read the part where I explicitly mentioned her marble countertops and his country club membership. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that I had heard every single selfish, disgusting thing they had whispered in the hallway. She realized that I was not a dead man in the basement morgue. I was alive. I was fully aware of their betrayal, and I was gone. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. I watched the screen closely, searching their faces for any sign of genuine remorse. I looked for a single tear of guilt. I waited to see if the horrific realization that they had almost murdered their own father would break their hearts, but I saw absolutely nothing of the sort. There was no guilt. There was no sorrow. There was no shame. There was only raw, pure, unadulterated financial terror. Alyssa dropped the letter onto the floor and grabbed the sides of her head. She began to hyperventilate. She screamed that her kitchen contractors were going to sue her into bankruptcy if she did not pay them by Friday. She completely ignored the fact that I had survived a catastrophic injury. She only cared that her impending inheritance had just walked out the door. She looked at Connor with wild, manic eyes and shrieked that they were completely ruined. She said that if I got to a lawyer, I would rewrite my will and cut them out of the estate permanently. Connor snapped out of his silent shock. His corporate survival instincts kicked into high gear. His face twisted into a mask of vicious determination. He told Alyssa to shut her mouth and stop panicking. He paced the floor of the hospital room, running his hands through his perfectly combed hair. He aggressively declared that they were not going to lose the money I had worked my entire life to save. He said I was just an old, broken mechanic, and they were smart, modern professionals. He said they could easily outmaneuver me if they acted fast enough. I listened as my son laid out a ruthless, calculated plan to destroy my life completely. He told his sister that they needed to leave the hospital immediately and go straight to the local police precinct. He said they would file an emergency missing persons report. He instructed Alyssa to cry and act like a devastated daughter. He said they would legally claim that the severe trauma of the car accident had caused me to suffer a complete psychotic break. They would tell the authorities that I had wandered out of the hospital in a state of severe dementia and that I was an immediate danger to myself and others. Alyssa wiped her eyes and nodded eagerly, catching on to his wicked scheme. She said they could use that police report to go directly to a judge and file for emergency medical and financial guardianship. Connor smiled a cold, greedy smile. He said once they had the emergency guardianship papers, they could legally freeze every single bank account I owned before I even had the chance to speak to an attorney. They would lock me out of my own finances and force me into a cheap state-run nursing home so they could sell my house and divide the cash exactly as they had originally planned. They did not waste another second. Connor grabbed the letter off the floor and shoved it deep into his suit pocket to destroy the evidence of my escape. They quickly adjusted their clothes and prepared to put their fake mourning masks back on for the nurses outside. They opened the heavy wooden door and rushed out of the room, eager to execute their fraudulent plan and seize the assets they believed rightfully belonged to them. The video feed cut to black. Tom closed the silver laptop and let out a long, heavy breath. He turned his head and looked at me with deep, protective anger. He said they were coming for me, and they were not going to play by the rules. I sat in my wheelchair and looked out at the pouring rain. The last, lingering shred of paternal affection I held for Connor and Alyssa completely evaporated, leaving behind an impenetrable wall of solid iron. They had just proven on hidden camera that their greed was absolutely bottomless. They were willing to legally destroy my mind and steal my freedom just to fund their extravagant lifestyles. They thought I was just an old fool who would easily fall into their bureaucratic trap. But they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They assumed they knew the full extent of my wealth. They thought they were fighting over a simple suburban house and a modest retirement pension. They had absolutely no idea about the blind trust or the millions of dollars I had quietly secured years ago. They had triggered a war for their inheritance, but I was holding an arsenal they could not possibly comprehend. They wanted to play a game of legal deception and fraudulent control. I took a deep breath despite the burning pain in my chest and told Tom to get the car ready. We had a ruthless estate attorney to meet and a perfect, flawless trap to build. Tom drove me deep into the rural Ohio countryside, far away from the prying eyes of the city and the reach of my greedy children. His property was a secluded timber cabin sitting perfectly hidden on 40 acres of dense forest. It was entirely surrounded by a heavy steel fence and an imposing locked iron gate. It was the perfect fortress for a man who needed to disappear. Tom transformed his spacious ground-floor guest room into a highly secure medical recovery ward. He hired a private physical therapist who was willing to work strictly off the books and ask absolutely no questions. The first 2 weeks in that cabin were a blur of absolute agonizing physical torture. My shattered right femur had been surgically stabilized with thick titanium rods by the private medical team, but the grueling rehabilitation process tested every single ounce of my remaining willpower. Every single time the therapist forced me to bend my knee or try to place the absolute slightest fraction of weight on my injured leg, my entire body screamed in burning protest. The pain was like hot coals grinding directly against my exposed nerves, but I did not shed a single tear of self-pity. Every time my muscles shook and I felt like collapsing, I just closed my eyes and pictured Connor rolling his arrogant eyes and casually checking his luxury watch in my hospital room. I pictured Alyssa whining about her imported Italian marble countertops while my heart monitor beeped faintly in the background. My deep paternal grief had completely burned away, leaving absolutely nothing inside my chest but a cold, solid core of pure iron. I turned that burning physical pain into high-octane fuel. I gritted my teeth and pushed myself through the agonizing exercises because I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to be strong enough to stand up on my own 2 feet when the time came to finally face them. Once my mind was completely sharp and my broken body was slowly knitting itself back together, Tom brought in the heavy legal artillery. He invited a man named Sterling Hayes out to the cabin. Sterling was not a standard paper-pushing lawyer. He was a ruthless, highly connected estate attorney who operated out of a massive glass high-rise office in Columbus. He was a legal shark dressed in a custom-tailored suit, and he possessed a brilliant, aggressive mind for dismantling fraudulent financial schemes. Tom had carefully briefed him on the basic situation before he arrived. When Sterling walked into my guest room, he looked at my battered body with a profound level of professional respect. I handed Sterling the silver laptop and showed him the hidden security camera footage from the hospital room. I watched the sharp, calculating look in Sterling's eyes as he listened to my children cheerfully sign my life away and eagerly discuss selling my family home. When the terrible video finished, Sterling slowly closed the laptop. He looked me directly in the eye and calmly stated that we were going to utterly destroy their legal standing and rip their arrogant world apart piece by piece. Sterling immediately set up a highly secure digital perimeter around my personal identity and my public finances. He tapped directly into his extensive legal network to closely monitor any moves Connor and Alyssa might make through the county court systems or the local police departments. It did not take long at all for my children to strike their next blow. Just 3 days after they discovered my empty hospital bed, Sterling arrived at the rural cabin holding a thick manila folder and wearing a deeply grim expression. He sat down heavily at Tom's rustic wooden dining table and pulled out copies of an official police report. Connor and Alyssa had marched straight into the local precinct dressed in fake panic and filed an emergency missing persons report. But they did not just tell the police that their injured father was missing. They completely fabricated a vicious, disgusting lie to legally assassinate my character. Sterling handed me the official report. I read the fabricated statements with my own eyes, and my blood boiled. Connor told the police detectives that I had been suffering from severe, aggressive, early-onset dementia for over a year. He claimed on a sworn public record that I was constantly confused and highly prone to violent psychotic outbursts. He stated that the extreme trauma of the car accident had massively accelerated my supposed cognitive decline. He told the police that I had wandered out of the intensive care unit in a state of severe mental delusion, and that I was in immediate danger to myself and the public. Alyssa backed up his disgusting lies perfectly. She played the role of the weeping, terrified daughter, telling the officers she was deathly worried that her senile old father was going to stumble blindly into highway traffic. But the fake police report was just the first preliminary phase of their coordinated attack. Sterling showed me the next set of documents proving that my children had taken that exact same fabricated police report directly to the manager of my local bank branch. They tried to use the active missing persons investigation to completely freeze my personal checking and savings accounts. Alyssa stood in the bank lobby dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, while Connor aggressively demanded that the branch manager instantly lock down my finances. They aggressively told the bank manager that I was an absolute danger to my own estate, and that they needed immediate administrative control over my money to prevent me from wandering the streets and giving my cash away to strangers. They were laying the exact legal groundwork to officially declare me mentally incompetent. They wanted to officially erase my legal identity and strip away my civil rights so they could quickly plunder my suburban house and liquidate my vintage trucks without facing a single legal hurdle. The sheer audacity of their smear campaign made my stomach turn. They were entirely willing to paint their own father as a crazy, senile old fool just to get their greedy hands on my cash a few weeks faster. Tom slammed his heavy fist against the wooden table, cursing their names in a low, furious growl. He said they were acting like common street criminals. Sterling remained perfectly calm, but noted that we needed to act incredibly fast to secure the visible assets they were actively trying to steal. Sterling looked at my basic financial file and stated that my modest mechanic pension and the equity in my suburban home were standard targets. He said we needed to lock those specific assets down tight before Connor and Alyssa found a corrupt judge to sign an emergency financial injunction. I looked at the brilliant attorney, and then I looked at my loyal brother-in-law. I took a deep, steadying breath and decided it was finally time to show them the entire board. I told Sterling that my children were currently fighting a dirty, vicious war over a few $100,000 in home equity and a basic checking account because they believed that was the absolute sum total of my entire life work. I told him they thought I was just a tired, retired heavy diesel mechanic who busted his knuckles for 40 years just to pay off a simple mortgage. I leaned forward in my wheelchair, resting my aching leg, and looked Sterling dead in the eye. I told him I was holding a financial arsenal my children could not possibly comprehend. I explained that exactly 10 years ago, while my beautiful Evelyn was still alive, and my children were just beginning to show their arrogant true colors, I made a massive calculated financial gamble. I had stumbled upon a huge, barren, abandoned commercial lot on the far outer edge of the county limit. Everyone in town, including my own children, thought it was completely useless swampland. But my decades working directly with heavy commercial transport logistics and studying highway routes told me a different story. I knew with absolute certainty that the city was eventually going to expand its industrial transport corridor directly into that specific zone. I took a massive portion of my hard-earned overtime savings and bought that ugly dirt lot for absolute pennies on the dollar. For years, Connor and Alyssa loudly mocked me for buying a useless swamp. They laughed at family dinners and called it the old man foolish mud puddle. They said I was throwing my retirement money away on wet dirt. But exactly 2 years ago, the county officially rezoned that entire massive district for high-tech commercial development, just as I had predicted. A massive global technology firm moved into the state to build a brand new sprawling logistics hub, and they absolutely needed my specific parcel of land to complete their master campus blueprint. They approached me with a staggering corporate buyout offer. I sold that barren dirt lot for exactly $6.5 million in pure cash. When I saw the sheer absolute shock wash over Tom and Sterling faces, I explained exactly why I had kept that massive fortune a complete secret from my family. I told them that after Evelyn passed away, I saw the creeping venomous greed slowly taking over Connor and Alyssa hearts. I saw them constantly measuring the value of my house and asking invasive calculating questions about my life insurance policies. They stopped asking about my health and only asked about my wealth. I desperately wanted to know if my children actually loved their father, or if they just loved the convenient automated teller machine I had always been to them. So I hired a private wealth management firm entirely out of state and quietly parked the entire $6.5 million into a highly secure blind trust. I deliberately chose to continue living my quiet, modest life in my regular suburban house. I continued to drive my old, reliable pickup truck, and I lived completely off my modest mechanic pension. I set up the blind trust as the ultimate test of their familial loyalty. I told Sterling that if Connor and Alyssa had rushed into that intensive care unit with genuine tears in their eyes, if they had demanded the surgeon save my life, regardless of the financial cost, I would have happily handed them the keys to a $6 million empire without a single second thought. I would have gladly given them the entire world, but they spectacularly failed the ultimate test. They priced my beating heart against their shiny new kitchen countertops and their fancy country club memberships. They willingly signed a piece of paper to let me suffocate and die, all so they could quickly inherit what they foolishly thought was my only money. Sterling Hayes sat back in his wooden chair, taking off his expensive glasses and wiping the lenses with a slow, deliberate motion. A sharp, highly dangerous smile slowly spread across his professional face. He completely understood the massive magnitude of the legal trap we were about to spring. My children were out there right now actively committing federal crimes, forging medical documents, and filing fake police reports, desperately trying to steal mere pennies, while remaining completely unaware that they had just aggressively disinherited themselves from a massive multi-million-dollar fortune. The rural safe house suddenly felt charged with high-voltage electricity. I was no longer a broken, grieving father hiding in the shadows from his cruel children. I was a man with overwhelming financial resources and a brilliant, ruthless legal mind by my side, ready to turn my children's disgusting greed into an inescapable iron vault. I looked at Sterling and told him to let them keep digging their own graves. We were going to wait for the perfect moment to bury them. The days inside Tom's heavily secured rural cabin dragged on with a slow, agonizing weight. My shattered femur throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, but I welcomed the pain. It kept my mind perfectly sharp. I spent hours sitting in my wheelchair staring out the heavy glass windows at the dense Ohio forest surrounding the property. I watched the autumn leaves falling to the wet ground, and I thought about the sheer depth of human greed. I had spent 40 years of my life sacrificing my own body, breaking my back under heavy diesel rigs just to ensure my children never had to struggle. I had given them absolutely everything. In return, they had signed my death warrant and were now actively hunting down my life savings. Sterling Hayes, my newly hired estate attorney, was an absolute master of digital surveillance and legal strategy. He had established a massive security perimeter around my identity, tracking every single move Connor and Alyssa made. He called the cabin on a secure line every evening to give Tom and me a detailed briefing. Sterling told us that my children had confidently marched into my primary bank branch, waving their fake missing persons report. They had aggressively demanded the branch manager freeze my accounts and grant them full administrative control. They told the manager I was wandering the streets in a state of violent, severe dementia, but my children were incredibly arrogant, and that arrogance made them foolish. Sterling explained that high-level bank managers do not simply hand over massive financial accounts just because a relative sheds a few fake tears and waves a police report. The bank manager had sternly informed Connor that without a formal court order or a comprehensive durable power of attorney document, they had absolutely no legal authority to touch a single dime of my money. Connor had completely lost his temper. He had screamed at the bank staff, threatening to sue them, demanding they release the funds immediately so he could pay his ridiculous country club initiation fees. But the bank stood firm and escorted them out of the lobby. When Sterling told me this over the phone, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew my son. Connor was entirely obsessed with social status, and he was desperate for cash. He would never simply accept defeat and walk away. I told Sterling that they would inevitably try to find a darker, illegal path to get what they wanted. I was absolutely right. Realizing they were completely locked out of my bank accounts by standard institutional rules, Connor and Alyssa decided to cross the permanent line into severe federal crime. They drove straight from the bank to my empty suburban house, the house I had paid for with 4 decades of blood and sweat. They unlocked the front door and marched directly into my private home office. Sterling had his private investigators watching the property from a distance, so we knew exactly when they went inside. They began desperately tearing through my personal filing cabinets, searching for any legal document they could use to seize control of my estate. They did not find a valid financial proxy, because I had never legally granted them one. But what they did find was far more emotionally devastating to me. Deep inside the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk, they found an old, voided medical proxy document. It was a terrifying piece of paper from 10 years ago. It was the exact medical proxy I had signed when my beautiful late wife Evelyn was losing her brutal battle with cancer. I remembered the exact day I signed that original document. I remembered sitting in a cold hospital room, holding Evelyn's fragile hand, crying silently as the lawyers explained the terrible legal necessity of medical proxies. It was a document born from profound tragedy and absolute heartbreak. I had kept a voided copy in my desk simply as a painful reminder of the hardest days of my life. To Connor and Alyssa, that sacred heartbreaking document was nothing more than a convenient bureaucratic template. They took the old paperwork filled with their dead mother's tragic medical history, and they used it to design a blueprint for absolute fraud. They scanned the old document into a computer, altered the dates, changed the specific legal clauses, and completely fabricated a brand new, sweeping, durable power of attorney. They drafted a document that falsely granted them absolute total control over every single aspect of my life. It gave them the fake authority to sell my properties, drain my bank accounts, and sign legal contracts in my name. Then they committed the ultimate crime. They forged my signature at the bottom of the page. Connor had watched me sign enough birthday cards and tuition checks over the decades to mimic my handwriting passably well. But a forged document is completely useless without an official notary seal. Connor reached out to a sleazy, corrupt business associate of his, a man who operated a shady title loan company downtown. For a few $1,000s in under-the-table cash, this associate illegally stamped and notarized the fraudulent power of attorney, officially certifying that I had signed it in his presence. They had successfully fabricated a master key to my entire life. Armed with this highly illegal, fraudulent document, Alyssa immediately moved to the next phase of their vicious scheme. Alyssa was a licensed real estate agent, but she was never a particularly honest one. She knew exactly how to manipulate the housing market to serve her own selfish interests. She knew that if she placed my house on the open public market, it would take months to sell. It would require public open houses, official inspections, and a long, transparent escrow process. She could not risk a long public sale because she was terrified I might suddenly reappear from my supposed dementia wandering and cancel the transaction. Alyssa needed fast, untraceable cash to pay off her expensive Italian marble kitchen contractors. So she decided to bypass the standard public listing process entirely. She used her real estate license to quietly set up a shadow pocket listing. She reached out directly to a private network of aggressive cash-only real estate investors who specialized in flipping properties rapidly. These were men who bought houses sight unseen at steep discounts, no questions asked, as long as the paperwork cleared quickly. She offered my beautiful family home for a massive, immediate cash discount. She priced it aggressively low, guaranteeing a lightning-fast closing process. She treated my home like a piece of stolen merchandise she needed to fence in a dark alley. Sitting in my wheelchair in the quiet safety of Tom's cabin, I felt a profound sense of violation wash over my soul. That house was not just a financial asset. It was the absolute center of my universe. It was the very first property Evelyn and I had ever owned. I spent 30 years paying off that mortgage month by month, check by check. I remembered spending 3 entire grueling summers replacing the roof with my own 2 hands to save money. I remembered building the wide wooden back deck piece by piece, where Evelyn and I used to sit on warm summer evenings drinking sweet tea and watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass. Every single brick of that house held a precious memory of our family. Alyssa and Connor were casually throwing 30 years of my beautiful history into the garbage disposal. They were selling my memories to sleazy cash flippers for a quick payday. They were rushing to liquidate my visible assets before they even bothered to confirm if their missing father was actually dead or alive. Their greed was an insatiable monster devouring everything sacred I had ever built. But my children were incredibly arrogant, and they severely underestimated the man they had left for dead. They thought I was a broken fool, but they had no idea that I was surrounded by men who hunted criminals for a living. When Sterling Hayes had first taken my case, he did not just monitor my bank accounts. He knew exactly how greedy real estate agents operated. He knew that the very first thing Alyssa would try to steal was the physical property itself. So Sterling had quietly placed a silent digital tripwire directly onto the legal deed of my house at the county courthouse. It was a highly specialized title, Monitoring Alert. The very second anyone attempted to legally transfer the title request, a formal deed copy, or register a new sale contract, the county computer system would instantly send a secure automated alert directly to Sterling's private server. It happened on a cold, foggy Tuesday morning. Tom was standing in the rustic kitchen of the cabin, pouring 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. I was sitting at the wooden dining table performing my grueling physical therapy stretches. The heavy iron gate at the end of the long driveway buzzed loudly. A few moments later, Sterling's sleek black luxury sedan rolled slowly up the gravel path. Sterling stepped out of the car, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. His face was entirely devoid of any emotion, but his eyes held a sharp, dangerous intensity. He walked through the front door, refused Tom's offer of coffee, and set his briefcase directly on the wooden table in front of me. He unlatched the leather straps and pulled out a single, freshly printed sheet of paper. He slid it across the table toward me. It was an official automated notification from the County Property Records Division. The document clearly stated that Alyssa, using her professional real estate license, had formally requested an expedited title transfer authorization for my residential address. She had officially submitted the forged durable power of attorney to the county clerk to legitimize a pending cash sale. The digital tripwire had been successfully tripped. Sterling leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. He looked at me with absolute serious clarity. He explained that up until this very second, my children had simply been terrible, selfish people. They had been morally bankrupt and emotionally cruel. But the exact moment Alyssa submitted that forged legal document to a government entity to execute a real estate transaction, they crossed a massive invisible boundary. Sterling laid out the terrifying reality of their actions. He explained that fabricating a power of attorney to seize assets was grand theft. Utilizing a corrupt notary to stamp a forged signature was conspiracy to commit fraud. Initiating an illegal real estate sale across state banking lines using fabricated authority constituted severe federal wire fraud. He told me that this was no longer a simple tragic family dispute over an inheritance. This was a highly orchestrated matrix of severe criminal felonies. Tom stood silently by the kitchen counter, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He looked at the legal document, and then he looked at me. He told me that my children were acting like dangerous predators, and it was officially time to stop treating them like family. I stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the table. I saw the official county seals and the digital timestamps documenting my daughter's elaborate crime. I thought about the sheer desperate greed required to sit in a room, look at your mother's tragic medical history, and decide to use it as a weapon to steal your father's home. The very last microscopic thread of paternal affection I held in my heart snapped instantly. It did not break with a roar of grief or a flood of sad tears. It severed with a cold, absolute silence. I looked up from the document and met Sterling's intense gaze. My voice was no longer a weak, raspy whisper. It was hard, solid, and completely unyielding. I asked him what our next move was. I told him I did not want to just call the local police and have them arrested quietly. I wanted to build a trap so devastatingly thorough that they could never possibly talk their way out of it. I wanted them to feel the exact same absolute terror and helplessness they had forced upon me when they left me paralyzed in that hospital bed. Sterling smiled a slow, predatory smile. He closed his leather briefcase and told me that the only way to perfectly spring a trap is to let the mouse walk all the way inside to grab the cheese. He said we were going to let Alyssa believe her brilliant, fraudulent scheme was actually working. We were going to provide her with the exact cash buyer she was so desperately searching for. The conflict had officially escalated far beyond a missing persons report and a frozen bank account. My children had boldly declared war against my entire existence. They were preparing to finalize the theft of my beautiful family home, completely unaware that every single step they took was being carefully orchestrated by the very man they had tried to erase. The trap was set, and the steel jaws were finally ready to snap shut. Sterling Hayes sat across from me at the heavy wooden dining table in Tom's cabin. The morning sun was trying to peek through the thick Ohio forest outside the window, but the mood inside the room was as cold and sharp as a fresh razor blade. We had the official county documents sitting right in front of us, proving that Alyssa had filed the forged power of attorney. Tom was pacing the floor, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. He wanted to call his old buddies at the state police immediately. He wanted to send a squad car right to Connor's fancy corporate office and drag him out in handcuffs in front of all his country club friends. It was a tempting thought. The idea of immediate vengeance felt like a warm fire in my chest. but I raised my hand and told Tom to stop pacing. I looked at Sterling and told him that simply calling the police right now was not going to be enough. If we just handed this over to the local authorities, my son would immediately hire a fleet of expensive defense lawyers. Connor would stand in front of a judge and claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He would say he genuinely thought I had wandered off and lost my mind, and that he was only trying to secure my assets for my own protection. He would paint himself as the devoted son, making difficult choices during a medical crisis. Alyssa would cry those fake tears of hers and play the innocent sister who just trusted her brother. They might get a slap on the wrist or a suspended sentence. I told Sterling I absolutely refused to let them talk their way out of this. I did not want a simple arrest. I wanted to build an airtight titanium vault of a trap. I wanted them to walk so far into their own criminal conspiracy that no expensive lawyer could ever pull them back out. Sterling smiled a very slow and calculating smile. He told me that he completely agreed. He said that to catch predators, you do not just chase them into the woods. You build a cage, and you fill it with the exact bait they cannot resist. We needed them to physically attempt to execute the fraudulent sale of my home. We needed them caught on tape, exchanging forged documents for cash. To do this properly, Sterling said we could not rely on standard police work. We needed absolute precision. He pulled his cell phone from his tailored suit pocket and made a brief phone call. Within 2 hours, a dark gray sports utility vehicle pulled up to the cabin gate. 2 men stepped out. They did not look like police officers or typical private eyes from the movies. They wore plain khakis and simple button-down shirts, looking entirely average and unremarkable. Sterling introduced them as former federal agents who now ran a highly exclusive private investigative firm out of Columbus. They specialized in high-stakes corporate espionage and severe financial fraud. They sat down at the table with us and listened quietly as Sterling laid out the entire situation. He explained the forged medical proxy, the fake police reports, and Alyssa trying to quietly list my family home on the underground market. The lead investigator, a broad-shouldered man named Jackson, nodded slowly. Jackson said that greedy people like Connor and Alyssa always act predictably when they think they are running out of time. They were terrified that I might somehow wander into a hospital and be identified, so they were rushing to liquidate my real estate. Jackson proposed a brilliant, completely flawless strategy. He said they were going to create a ghost. Jackson explained the concept of the honey trap. Since Alyssa was using her real estate license to quietly shop my house around to private cash buyers, Jackson's firm would provide her with the perfect target. They created an entire fake corporate persona. One of Jackson's best undercover operatives, a man named Richard, would play the role of an aggressive, wealthy out-of-state property developer. Richard would pretend to be a ruthless investor from out west who bought residential properties sight unseen for pure cash. His character was designed to be exactly the kind of buyer Alyssa was desperately praying for. Someone with massive amounts of liquid money who completely ignored standard inspection protocols and simply wanted a lightning-fast closing process. We spent the entire afternoon building the bait. Jackson's team completely fabricated a digital footprint for Richard. They set up fake corporate websites, dummy phone numbers, and a verifiable banking history, just in case Connor tried to look him up. They knew Connor was obsessed with wealth and status, so they made Richard look incredibly successful and dangerously impatient. Richard would contact Alyssa directly, claiming he had heard through private channels that she had a pocket listing available. He would offer to buy my beautiful brick family home for cash, closing the deal in a matter of days rather than months. The beauty of the trap was its absolute simplicity. Richard would make it very clear that he did not care about the condition of the property or the background of the seller. He would only care about getting the deed signed and notarized immediately. This would force Connor and Alyssa to physically present the forged power of attorney in a legally binding commercial transaction. They would have to sit down at a table, hand over the fabricated documents, and attempt to collect a massive fraudulent check. I sat in my wheelchair listening to these professional men meticulously plan the destruction of my children. They detailed how they would wire the closing location with microscopic hidden cameras and high-definition audio recorders. Every single lie Connor told, every single fake signature Alyssa provided would be captured from 3 different angles and transmitted directly to a secure server. Sterling assured me that once we had that footage, we would hand-deliver it to the district attorney. It would be an absolute slam-dunk federal wire fraud and elder abuse case. They would go to state prison, and they would never see it coming. The plan was put into motion the very next morning. Richard made the initial phone call to Alyssa. Jackson let us listen to the recorded audio of that first contact. I heard my daughter's voice on the speakerphone. She sounded anxious and breathless when she answered. But the very second Richard mentioned he was a cash investor looking to close on my exact property within 72 hours, her entire tone changed. The greed bled through the audio, completely masking her anxiety. She eagerly told Richard that she had the exclusive listing and that she held the full power of attorney for her elderly father, who was unfortunately incapacitated. I closed my eyes and clenched my jaw as I heard my own daughter effortlessly lie to a stranger, declaring me legally incompetent just to secure a quick payday. Richard pushed the hook deeper. He offered a cash price, slightly below market value, but promised to waive all inspections and hand over a certified cashier check the moment the deed was signed. Alyssa practically tripped over her own words, rushing to accept the offer. She agreed to set up a private meeting to finalize the paperwork at the end of the week. The trap was set, and my children had marched straight into the steel jaws. With the trap officially primed and waiting to be sprung, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the rural cabin. Sterling and the investigators returned to the city to prepare the closing location, leaving Tom and me alone in the deep woods. For the next 3 days, I had absolutely nothing to do but endure my grueling physical therapy and sit alone with my own dark thoughts. The physical pain in my shattered leg was a constant burning reminder of my survival, but the psychological toll of what I was about to do to my own flesh and blood began to weigh on my chest like a block of solid concrete. I spent hours staring out the glass windows at the gray autumn sky, watching the rain strip the dead leaves from the branches. My mind relentlessly tortured me with memories from decades ago. I remembered holding Connor when he was just a tiny baby, marveling at his little hands, and promising myself I would work until my bones broke to give him a perfect life. I remembered Alyssa running across the front yard in a bright yellow summer dress, laughing as I chased her with a garden hose. They were innocent once. They were my entire world. I had spent 40 years sacrificing my sleep, my health, and my own dreams to build a fortress of security around them. And now I was sitting in a hidden cabin actively collaborating with federal investigators to send them both to a maximum security prison. The guilt started to creep into my mind, whispering terrible doubts. I wondered if I had failed them as a father. I wondered if my constant absence, working double shifts in the freezing diesel garage, had somehow caused their hearts to grow so cold. I asked myself if maybe I should just call the whole thing off. I could just walk away, let them have the house, and disappear completely with my hidden trust fund. I could spare them the absolute destruction of a criminal trial. The thought of my own daughter sitting in a cold concrete jail cell made my stomach physically turn. Tom walked into the room and saw me staring blankly at the rain. He knew exactly what was happening inside my head. He had seen that look 1,000 times during his career on the police force. He pulled a wooden chair directly in front of my wheelchair and sat down, leaning forward so we were eye to eye. He did not offer me a gentle hug or soft, comforting words. He offered me the hard, grounded truth that only a true brother could provide. Tom looked at me and told me to stop torturing myself with memories of children that no longer existed. He said the little boy I taught to ride a bicycle and the little girl I chased in the yard died a long time ago. They were replaced by selfish, arrogant adults who made a conscious, calculated choice. He reminded me of the sterile intensive care unit. He painted the picture clearly, using words that cut through my lingering paternal guilt like a knife. He told me to remember the exact sound of their voices when they stood over my broken, bleeding body and complained about country club fees and imported marble countertops. He said, "Harrison, they did not just make a small mistake. They looked a trauma surgeon in the eye and legally ordered him to let you suffocate to death. They treated your beating heart like an inconvenient obstacle blocking their bank accounts. They forged your dead wife's medical paperwork to steal the house she loved. You did not do this to them. You did not force them to be monsters. They made their bed the exact moment they signed that do not resuscitate order and walked out of the hospital laughing about a ski trip." Tom placed his large, calloused hand firmly on my shoulder. He told me that stopping the trap now would not be an act of mercy. It would be an act of absolute foolishness. He said if I let them get away with this, they would spend the rest of their lives believing they were untouchable. They would destroy other people the exact same way they tried to destroy me. He looked deep into my tired eyes and told me I had a duty to hold them accountable. He told me to fortify my heart and finish the job. His words hit me with the force of a freight train. The crushing weight of the guilt slowly dissolved, replaced by a clear, absolute resolve. Tom was entirely right. My children were not victims of circumstance. They were predators who had willingly preyed upon my supposed weakness. I thought about Evelyn. I thought about how sickened and heartbroken she would be to see the selfish, greedy adults our children had become. She would never want me to lay down and let them profit from my murder. She would want me to stand up and deliver absolute, total justice. I closed my eyes and took a deep, ragged breath, fighting through the sharp pain in my ribs. I pictured the empty hospital bed. I pictured the forged power of attorney. And then I pictured the incredible future I could build with the millions of dollars I had hidden away. A future where my money actually went to people who needed it, rather than funding the arrogant lifestyles of two criminals. I opened my eyes and looked at Tom. I nodded my head, slowly feeling the iron return to my spine. My doubts were completely gone. I was ready to watch the trap snap shut. I was ready to watch them lose everything. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair and forced myself to stand. My shattered right leg screamed in burning agony, sending shockwaves of pure fire all the way up to my damaged neck. The physical therapist had told me I should only practice standing with heavy assistance, but I needed to prove to myself that I was no longer a helpless victim. My muscles shook violently under my own weight. Sweat beaded instantly on my forehead, but I locked my knees and stood tall. Tom watched me carefully, his hands hovering just inches away, ready to catch me if I collapsed. But he did not intervene. He knew I needed this victory. Every second I remained standing felt like a triumph over the death sentence Connor and Alyssa had signed for me. The physical pain was a grounding anchor locking me into the present reality. I was not the ghost they wanted me to be. I was a man forged from 40 years of grinding industrial labor, and my spirit was infinitely stronger than their shallow corporate greed. I stood there staring out the window at the heavy timberline, feeling the power return to my broken bones. I silently swore to the memory of my late wife that I would not let our legacy be poisoned by their actions. I slowly lowered myself back into the chair, breathing heavily, but feeling an incredible, profound sense of peace. My heart was completely fortified. The preparation was over. The stage was perfectly set. Tomorrow they would walk into a coffee shop, expecting to walk out as rich, successful elites. But they were actually walking straight into a concrete wall of federal justice, and I was going to be the one holding the absolute final key. The morning of the sting operation arrived with a bitter, biting chill in the air that seemed to seep directly through the thick timber walls of Tom's rural cabin. Inside the heavily secured safe house, the atmosphere was incredibly dense, thick with an agonizing, heavy anticipation that made my chest physically ache. Sterling Hayes and the lead private investigator, Jackson, had established a temporary digital command center right on top of the rustic wooden dining table. Multiple glowing laptop screens illuminated the dimly lit room, displaying live high-definition video feeds from a high-end luxury coffee shop located deep in the financial district of Columbus. Jackson's elite undercover team had worked through the entire night to perfectly rig the private meeting room at the back of the cafe. They had meticulously embedded microscopic camera lenses inside the ceiling smoke detectors within the thick leaves of the decorative potted plants, and even directly inside the silver sugar dispensers resting on the center of the polished oak table. Every single square inch of that private room was monitored by crystal-clear, ultra-sensitive audio recorders capable of picking up a mere whisper. I sat rigidly in my heavy medical wheelchair, my shattered right leg throbbing with a familiar, relentless, burning ache. My eyes were glued absolutely tight to the center monitor. Tom stood directly behind me like a massive stone gargoyle, his large calloused hands resting heavily on the rubber grips of my chair. We watched the screen as Richard, the highly trained undercover operative, playing the role of a ruthless out-of-state cash investor, casually sipped a dark espresso. Richard wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit and a heavy gold watch that caught the overhead lights perfectly. He exuded an aura of dangerous wealth and deep impatience. He looked exactly like a man who bought and sold human lives before breakfast, a man who possessed unlimited funds and asked absolutely zero questions. My heart hammered wildly against my bruised ribs, matching the rhythmic throbbing in my leg. The moment of absolute truth was finally here. I was about to sit in the quiet safety of this cabin and watch my own flesh and blood willingly commit severe federal crimes on a live broadcasted video feed. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the coffee shop swung open on the monitor. Connor and Alyssa walked confidently into the frame, and my stomach immediately twisted into a cold, hard, sickening knot. They did not look like grieving, devastated children whose elderly father was supposedly wandering the dangerous city streets in a state of severe, untreated dementia. They did not carry an ounce of sorrow or worry in their posture. Instead, they looked exactly like arrogant royalty, arriving to collect their demanded tribute. Connor wore an impeccably tailored navy blue suit with a crisp, stark white shirt. His hair was styled perfectly slicked back without a single strand out of place. In his right hand, he held a sleek, expensive leather briefcase that undoubtedly contained the forged legal documents they were using to steal my life's work. Alyssa walked right beside him, matching his arrogant stride. She wore an expensive beige designer trench coat and clutched a luxury handbag that easily cost more than I used to make in an entire month of busting my knuckles on frozen diesel engines. They radiated a sickening, toxic aura of absolute entitlement and completely unearned superiority. They smiled warmly and politely at the young barista behind the counter as they walked purposely toward the private back room, completely and utterly oblivious to the massive reality that they were marching directly into an inescapable federal trap. Richard stood up immediately to greet them as they entered the room. He offered a firm, commanding professional handshake, playing the role of the busy, impatient corporate buyer completely flawlessly. Connor eagerly took his hand, flashing a brilliant, utterly fake salesman smile. I watched my son confidently pull out a chair and sit down at the table. He did not bother to ask Richard about his flight into town. He did not engage in polite, introductory small talk. His greed was far too intense for basic manners. He went straight for the financial jugular. Connor immediately popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase and reached inside. He pulled out a thick stack of complex real estate transfer papers and the highly fraudulent, newly minted durable power of attorney. He laid the documents out flat on the polished wooden table, smoothing the edges with his hands, like a proud hunter displaying a fresh, bloody kill. Alyssa sat right next to him, her posture rigid with anticipation. Her eyes practically glowed with raw, unfiltered greed as she looked at the undercover investigator. She eagerly leaned forward, placing her manicured hands on the table, and told Richard that they were incredibly happy to expedite the closing process to properly accommodate his extremely busy investment schedule. She smiled sweetly and said her family always prioritized efficiency and seamless business transactions. Hearing my daughter use the sacred word family to actively facilitate a massive criminal theft made my blood run entirely cold. I gripped the armrests of my wheelchair so tightly that my knuckles turned pure white, the physical strain sending sharp bolts of pain up my forearms. On the screen, Richard slowly pulled a heavy silver pen from his inside suit pocket. He began to carefully and deliberately review the documents. He played the psychological game with terrifying, masterful precision. He flipped through the pages incredibly slowly, letting his eyes linger on random paragraphs, purposely creating a heavy, deeply uncomfortable silence in the small room. I could physically see Connor shifting anxiously in his chair, his leg bouncing slightly beneath the table. Alyssa kept nervously tapping her expensive fingernails against her porcelain coffee cup, her fake smile beginning to strain at the corners of her mouth. Richard finally stopped turning the pages. He rested his finger on the final page of the preliminary title transfer right where my forged signature rested directly beneath the corrupt, illegally obtained notary stamp. He looked up at my children, furrowed his brow with feigned concern, and leaned back heavily in his leather chair. He let out a slow, calculated, doubtful sigh. Richard looked directly at Connor and told him that he was fully prepared to hand over the massive cashier check today, but he had a small, lingering, serious concern about the ultimate legal liability of the transaction. He pointed the tip of his silver pen directly at the power of attorney document. He explained that buying a highly valued residential property entirely through a medical proxy was always a slightly tricky and risky business for out-of-state investors like himself. He maintained his intense eye contact with Connor and asked a simple, incredibly dangerous question. Richard asked if the father, the actual legal owner of the property, was fully and completely aware of this specific financial transaction. He kept his tone perfectly professional, stating that he simply needed absolute verbal reassurance that no angry, confused old man was going to suddenly show up at the property next week, hiring local attorneys and loudly claiming his beloved house was stolen right out from under him. The tension inside the cabin was absolutely suffocating. I held my breath, my chest tight. Tom gripped the rubber handles of my wheelchair even tighter, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sterling Hayes leaned closer to the glowing monitor, his sharp, predatory eyes focused entirely on Connor's face. This was the exact pivot point of the entire operation. This was the moment that would define their absolute guilt. If Connor simply lied, and said I was resting comfortably in a nursing home, entirely aware but physically unable to attend the trap, would only capture a standard basic fraud case. But Jackson had specifically trained Richard to push heavily on the exact psychological pressure points of greedy, deeply arrogant men. Richard casually added a slight smirk to his face. He told Connor that he did not want to deal with a messy, drawn-out legal battle over some old man's senile regrets. He openly challenged Connor's authority in the room, and I knew deep down in my bones that my son's massive, fragile ego would never allow a stranger to question his absolute control over the situation. Connor let out an arrogant, highly dismissive laugh. He leaned aggressively across the table, completely taking the psychological bait. He looked at Richard with a smug, superior grin and told him there was absolutely zero chance of any legal pushback or messy court battles. Connor lowered his voice into a hushed, conspiratorial whisper, leaning right into the hidden microphone perfectly embedded in the sugar dispenser. My son looked the investigator in the eye and said his father was just a broken, useless old mechanic whose brain was completely gone. He stated clearly on crystal-clear, high-definition audio that I was currently wandering around the state in a condition of severe, irreversible mental collapse. He confidently lied that I could not even remember my own name, let alone remember the address of a house I used to own. But Richard was relentless. He pushed just a tiny fraction harder, maintaining his doubtful expression. He tapped the thick paper and casually noted that the signature on the medical proxy looked surprisingly fresh and incredibly steady for a man suffering from such severe, debilitating dementia. The absolute unchecked arrogance of my children instantly took full control of their mouths. Connor smirked widely and openly bragged to the undercover investigator. He said that the old man did not actually sign the paper this week. Connor admitted with absolutely zero hesitation that they had dug up an old voided medical document from when their mother was sick, and they had completely backdated the signature themselves to fit the current timeline. He proudly confessed on a live federal wire that he had personally paid a local associate a few $1,000s in cash to illegally and retroactively notarize the blatant forgery. Alyssa chimed in immediately, entirely unable to keep her mouth shut, effectively sealing her own criminal fate alongside her brother. She laughed a cold, heartless, dismissive laugh and told Richard that they were simply taking their rightful inheritance a few years early to save on taxes. She explicitly stated on camera that the house truly belonged to them anyway, because they were the young, successful professionals who actually knew how to properly manage wealth in the modern world. Connor nodded in enthusiastic, arrogant agreement. He told Richard that I was just a simple blue-collar fool who would have eventually squandered the property money on useless hospital bills or a cheap, depressing nursing home. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and proudly declared, "It's our money anyway, so we just bypassed the annoying legal bureaucracy." I sat frozen in the cabin, listening to my own flesh and blood openly and proudly confess to severe elder abuse, document forgery, and massive grand theft. My heart broke into 1,000 irreparable, jagged pieces, but the iron resolve in my chest completely solidified, pushing out any remaining shadows of doubt. There was absolutely no more guilt inside me. There was no more paternal hesitation. They had just happily dug their own federal graves on live recorded tape, completely blinded by their insatiable hunger for my assets. On the screen, Richard smiled a warm, deeply appreciative smile. The fake tension completely left his shoulders. He told Connor that he deeply respected a man who knew exactly how to cut through the useless red tape and take firm control of his family business. Richard reached slowly into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy white envelope. He slid it smoothly across the polished wooden table. Connor practically lunged forward, snatching the envelope directly from Richard's hands. He aggressively tore the top open and pulled out a massive, official-looking cashier check. It was a complete masterful forgery generated by Jackson's investigative firm, but to Connor and Alyssa, it looked exactly like their golden ticket to endless luxury and absolute freedom. Connor visually inspected the amount, his eyes widening with pure greedy delight as he saw the string of zeros. Without a single second of hesitation, Connor grabbed the silver pen and immediately signed his name on the final real estate transfer documents, permanently cementing the fraudulent sale in ink. Alyssa eagerly leaned over and co-signed as the secondary beneficiary, legally cementing her active, willing participation in the massive criminal conspiracy. Richard carefully gathered the signed transfer documents, the forged power of attorney, and the illegal property deed. He meticulously stacked the papers, placed them securely inside his heavy leather briefcase, and locked the brass clasps with a loud, incredibly definitive click that echoed through our cabin speakers. He stood up, smoothly, shook their hands one final time, and told them it was a genuine, absolute pleasure doing business with them. Connor and Alyssa practically floated out of the coffee shop, holding their fake cashier check close to their chests, smiling widely and completely oblivious to the massive reality that their entire lives were now effectively over. Back in the quiet safety of the rural cabin, Sterling Hayes slowly reached forward and closed the silver laptop. The screen went dark. Sterling looked at me with a grim, deeply satisfied, heavily professional expression. He stated clearly that we now possessed absolute, irrefutable, high-definition proof of massive federal wire fraud, criminal conspiracy document forgery, and severe elder financial abuse. The trap was officially perfectly shut. The final checkmate was complete. I sat in my wheelchair feeling the heavy, agonizing ache in my shattered leg, and I knew with absolute unyielding certainty that the next time I saw my children, it would be inside a cold courtroom where their arrogant, greedy smiles would be permanently erased. Sterling Hayes sat at the cabin table, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. Our sting operation at the coffee shop had worked perfectly. We had Connor and Alyssa on crystal clear audio and video committing federal wire fraud and forgery. But Sterling explained that greedy people do not just stop when they think they have won a small victory. Their hunger is a bottomless pit. A few days after they signed those fake real estate papers, Connor received a phone call from a corrupt bank teller he had been bribing for years. This teller had been illegally digging through massive financial mainframes and stumbled across a hidden digital link connecting my basic checking account to my private out-of-state blind trust. The teller discovered the massive $6.5 million tech buyout. When Connor and Alyssa realized that I was not just a retired mechanic with a modest suburban house, their greed mutated into absolute aggressive madness. They completely abandoned their sneaky real estate flip. They wanted the entire $6.5 million, and they wanted it right that very second. Sterling handed me a thick stack of court documents. My children had hired a notoriously aggressive probate litigation firm in Columbus. They had filed an emergency injunction in the county probate court. They were legally petitioning a judge to declare me either officially deceased or entirely mentally incompetent. They submitted fabricated medical affidavits claiming my mind was completely destroyed by severe dementia and the recent car accident. They spun a tragic, completely fake narrative that I had wandered out of the intensive care unit in a violent, psychotic haze, lost forever in the dangerous city streets. They were demanding that the judge grant them absolute, immediate legal control over the blind trust so they could protect my assets from being lost. It was a spectacular, disgusting web of lies. They wanted the judge to hand them the keys to a multi-million-dollar fortune based on a fictional tragedy they had orchestrated themselves. I sat in my heavy wheelchair looking at those court filings, feeling a strange, dark calm wash over my entire body. The initial heartbreak of their betrayal had long since burned away, leaving behind a reinforced spine of solid steel. I looked at Tom, who was clenching his large fists in the corner of the room, and then I looked at Sterling. I told them that I was absolutely done hiding in the shadows. I told them that when the probate hearing took place, I was not going to send a lawyer to speak for me. I was going to walk into that courtroom and look my children dead in their arrogant eyes. The next 48 hours were the most physically agonizing days of my entire life. I absolutely refused to roll into that courtroom in a wheelchair. I needed my children to see me standing tall, a living, breathing testament to their complete failure to destroy me. Tom brought me a heavy, solid oak cane he had carved himself. It was thick and unyielding, exactly what I needed to support my shattered right femur. My private physical therapist warned me that trying to walk could cause massive damage to my healing bones, but I completely ignored him. I gripped that oak cane and forced myself to stand. Every single step I took across the wooden floorboards of the cabin sent screaming, white-hot bolts of pure agony radiating straight up my spine. My muscles violently trembled, and cold sweat poured down my face, but I used the burning pain as biological fuel. Every step was a step toward absolute justice. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy, gray, freezing downpour that perfectly matched the cold reality of what was about to happen. Tom drove his large truck down the long highway toward Columbus, the windshield wipers slapping aggressively against the heavy rain. Sterling Hayes followed right behind us in his sleek, black luxury sedan. I sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, feeling the steady thumping ache in my leg. I was not nervous. I was not afraid. I was a father marching into battle to dismantle the monsters I had accidentally raised. We arrived at the massive, imposing county courthouse just as the morning session was beginning. Sterling had arranged for us to enter through a secure side entrance used by court staff, completely avoiding the main public lobby, where Connor and Alyssa might accidentally spot us too early. We quietly navigated the back hallways and positioned ourselves inside a small, empty consultation room directly adjacent to the main probate courtroom. The heavy oak double doors of the courtroom were slightly cracked open, allowing the clear, echoing sound of the proceedings to drift directly into our hiding space. I leaned heavily on my solid oak cane, listening intently as the hearing officially commenced. The judge, a stern older man with a booming voice, called the emergency injunction to order. Immediately, the expensive, slick-talking lawyer my children had hired took the floor. His voice was smooth, highly practiced, and dripping with fabricated, sickening sympathy. He began to paint an incredibly tragic, thoroughly disgusting picture for the judge. He stood in that courtroom and passionately described me as a dedicated, hard-working, blue-collar father who had tragically lost his mind. He claimed that the brutal car accident had shattered my fragile mental state, throwing me into the terrifying, confusing abyss of advanced dementia. He told the judge that my poor, devoted children were suffering unimaginable emotional agony, desperately searching the streets for their lost, senile father. Then the lawyer smoothly transitioned to the core focus of their true objective, the money. He dramatically explained that his clients had recently discovered a massive, complex, blind trust containing $6.5 million that I had supposedly hidden away during my mental decline. He passionately argued that because I was severely legally incompetent and completely missing the court, needed to immediately transfer full executive control of that trust to Connor and Alyssa to prevent the funds from being mismanaged or stolen. The absolute staggering audacity of their lies made my blood boil in my veins. They were using my decades of back-breaking labor and my careful financial planning to justify stealing my entire life. I heard Alyssa begin to cry in the courtroom. It was that same high-pitched theatrical sobbing I had witnessed on the hidden camera footage in my hospital room. She wailed loudly, telling the judge between fake dramatic gasps that she just wanted her daddy to be safe but that they desperately needed to secure his finances so they could afford to hire private search teams to find me. Connor chimed in, using his deep, serious corporate voice, solemnly swearing to the judge that they were only acting out of pure, unselfish love for their sick father. The judge listened quietly to their spectacular performance. I heard the rustling of heavy paper as he reviewed their fabricated medical affidavits and the fraudulent missing persons report. The judge let out a long, heavy sigh, completely deceived by their emotional manipulation. He spoke into his microphone, his voice echoing through the chamber, stating that based on the clear, unopposed evidence of my severe mental incapacity and my ongoing disappearance, he was fully prepared to grant the emergency injunction and sign over full administrative control of the blind trust to my children. Sterling Hayes looked at me from across the small consultation room. He gave me a sharp, definitive nod. The trap had been completely loaded. The bait had been swallowed. It was time to drop the absolute hammer. I tightened my grip on the thick oak cane until my knuckles turned stark white. I ignored the excruciating burning pain radiating from my shattered femur. I pushed the small consultation door open and stepped out into the main marble hallway, moving directly toward the massive, imposing double doors of the probate courtroom. Tom walked instantly to my left side, his massive frame radiating pure protective intimidation. Sterling walked to my right, clutching his heavy leather briefcase containing the absolute, irrefutable proof of their federal crimes. I reached out with my free hand and pushed the heavy wooden courtroom doors wide open. The massive brass hinges let out a loud, groaning creak that cut violently through the quiet, solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. The heavy thud of my solid oak cane striking the polished marble floor echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Every single head in the entire courtroom whipped around instantly. The bailiff, the court reporter, the judge, and the expensive litigation lawyer all stared at the doorway in absolute stunning confusion. I did not look at any of them. I locked my eyes directly onto the backs of my children's heads as they sat at the plaintiff table. I took a slow, deliberate, agonizing step forward. Thud. Another step. Thud. I kept my spine absolutely rigid, refusing to show a single ounce of physical weakness or pain. I channeled 40 years of freezing winters, busted knuckles, and heavy diesel grease into my posture. I was not a frail, wandering ghost suffering from dementia. I was a furious, unyielding father bringing an absolute storm of justice down upon their heads. Connor was the first to turn around. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of my cane and casually glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see a late-arriving clerk or a random court observer. The very second his arrogant eyes landed on my face, the physical transformation was completely, terrifyingly instantaneous. The healthy, confident color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale ash gray. His jaw dropped completely open, and his eyes bulged wide with pure, unadulterated, absolute terror. He looked exactly like a man who was staring directly into the eyes of the Grim Reaper. He physically recoiled his body, slamming hard against the wooden back of his courtroom chair, as if an invisible, massive force had just punched him squarely in the chest. Alyssa felt his sudden, violent movement and immediately turned her head to see what had terrified her brother. She saw me walking slowly and purposefully down the center aisle of the courtroom, flanked by a massive retired state trooper and a ruthless corporate attorney. The fake theatrical tears on her face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer catastrophic horror. She let out a sharp, breathless, involuntary gasp, raising her trembling hands to cover her mouth as she completely lost the ability to breathe. They were staring at the ghost who had just walked out of the grave to drag them down into hell. They realized in that single horrifying split second that their entire massive, elaborate millions-of-dollar scheme had just spectacularly imploded right in front of a sitting judge. The expensive lawyer they had hired looked at his clients, shaking in terror, completely confused by their sudden panic. The judge leaned far over his elevated wooden bench, his brow deeply furrowed in absolute shock, as he watched an supposedly dead, severely dementia-ridden man walk steadily toward him. I did not stop until I reached the low wooden swinging gate that separated the public gallery from the legal tables. I stood just 10 feet away from my trembling, hyperventilating children. I looked at Connor, watching his expensive suit jacket visibly shake as he struggled to process my existence. I looked at Alyssa, watching the absolute catastrophic realization completely shatter her greedy, arrogant world. I turned my gaze away from my failures and looked directly up at the judge. The courtroom was so incredibly silent that you could hear the heavy rain beating against the large glass windows outside. I planted my solid oak cane firmly on the polished floor, stood to my absolute full height, and cleared my throat. When I spoke, my voice did not tremble. It did not waver. It was not the weak, confused babble of a senile old man. It was a deep, resonant, terrifyingly clear baritone that completely filled the entire judicial chamber. I looked the judge perfectly in the eye and stated my name clearly for the official court record. I told him that I was Harrison Blake, the exact man my children were just attempting to declare legally dead and mentally incompetent. I gestured toward Connor and Alyssa with a cold, sweeping motion of my hand, completely dismissing their existence. I told the judge that I was fully alive, completely in possession of all my mental faculties, and absolutely aware of every single severe federal crime my children had committed over the past month. I stated that I had not come to this courtroom to defend myself against their disgusting, fabricated lies. I had come to submit irrefutable high-definition video evidence of their massive criminal conspiracy, and I was fully prepared to watch them leave this building in handcuffs. The absolute deafening shockwave that hit that courtroom was the most satisfying, beautiful silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. The entire probate courtroom instantly froze in a state of suspended animation. For several long, heavy seconds, the only sound was the fierce autumn rain pounding relentlessly against the tall glass windows. The expensive, slick litigation attorney that my children had hired looked as if he had just swallowed a mouthful of broken glass. He stammered frantically, trying to gather his scattered legal papers, his highly practiced, arrogant demeanor completely shattered by my sudden physical presence. He looked wildly at his clients, and then looked back at me, realizing in real time that he had been hired to represent two massive frauds. Connor and Alyssa were physically trembling in their wooden chairs, entirely incapable of processing the reality that the father they thought was dead or wandering mindlessly in a ditch was currently staring a hole directly through their souls. The judge broke the suffocating silence. His booming voice commanded immediate order. He demanded to know exactly what was happening in his courtroom and why a man declared missing and incapacitated was standing firmly before his bench. That was the precise moment Sterling Hayes stepped forward. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, lethal confidence of an apex predator that had already cornered its prey. Sterling walked directly up to the central wooden podium and addressed the bench with terrifying professional clarity. He formally introduced himself as my retained legal counsel, and he stated in a voice that carried to the very back of the gallery that we were here to prevent the court from being used as a weapon in a massive criminal conspiracy. Sterling unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed loudly like the cocking of a loaded weapon. He pulled out a thick stack of meticulously organized documents and handed the first heavy folder directly to the court clerk to be passed up to the judge. Sterling's voice filled the room as he began the absolute legal slaughter. He started directly with the fraudulent medical proxy. He explained to the judge exactly how my children had dug up an old voided medical document from when my late wife, Evelyn, was dying of cancer. I watched the judge's face transform from severe confusion into absolute profound disgust as Sterling detailed how Connor and Alyssa had maliciously altered the dates and specific legal clauses to fabricate a brand new, sweeping, durable power of attorney. Sterling did not just make wild verbal accusations. He provided absolute, undeniable physical proof. He handed the judge a comprehensive sworn affidavit from an independent forensic handwriting expert. The expert analysis conclusively proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the signature on the power of attorney was a blatant, clumsy forgery. Sterling pointed his finger directly at Connor and declared that my son had personally fabricated the signature and then paid a corrupt downtown notary a few $1,000s in under-the-table cash to illegally stamp the fraudulent document. Connor was visibly shaking uncontrollably. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He opened his mouth to object, to scream that it was a lie, but absolutely no words came out. His throat was completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated fear. Alyssa was hyperventilating beside him, her expensive designer handbag slipping from her grasp and spilling its contents onto the polished marble floor. She looked exactly like a trapped animal, desperately searching for an exit that simply did not exist. But Sterling Hayes was just getting started with his brutal dismantling of their lives. He told the judge that the forged power of attorney was merely the administrative key my children had fabricated to unlock a much larger criminal theft. Sterling pulled a silver digital tablet from his briefcase and requested permission to submit digital audio and video evidence directly to the court record. The judge, whose face was now a mask of cold judicial fury, granted the request immediately. Sterling explained the entire undercover sting operation to the court. He told the judge how my daughter had used her professional real estate license to illegally list my beloved family home for a rapid under-the-table cash sale. He explained how we had deployed a private investigative firm to provide them with a fake, out-of-state cash buyer. Sterling pressed a button on his tablet, and the high-definition audio from the coffee shop meeting began to play loudly through the courtroom speakers. My children's own arrogant voices filled the quiet judicial chamber. Every single person in the room listened in absolute horrified silence as Connor smugly bragged to the undercover investigator. His recorded voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, loudly declaring that my brain was completely gone and that I was wandering the streets in a state of severe mental collapse. The audio clearly captured him laughing about backdating the forged signature. Then came Alyssa's voice, sounding incredibly cold and heartless, telling the fake buyer that they were just taking their inheritance early to save on taxes, because it was their money anyway. I stood leaning heavily on my solid oak cane, watching my children as their own recorded words destroyed their entire lives. They literally shrank in their seats, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Alyssa buried her face in her trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her cruel, greedy statements played back for the judge to hear. Connor stared blankly down at the wooden table, his face slick with cold sweat, utterly defeated by the undeniable reality of his own massive arrogance. They had walked into this building expecting to be handed full control of a $6.5 million trust fund, and instead they were being publicly exposed as absolute monsters. When the audio recording finally ended, the silence in the courtroom was incredibly heavy and deeply oppressive. The judge sat perfectly still behind his elevated wooden bench. He slowly took off his reading glasses and looked down at Connor and Alyssa with a level of pure, unbridled contempt that I had never seen on a human face before. He did not see a devoted son and a worried daughter. He saw two ruthless, calculating predators who had willingly manipulated the legal system to steal from their own injured father. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with terrifying force. He did not mince his words. His voice was a booming thunderclap of absolute righteous fury. He immediately and permanently denied their emergency injunction. He forcefully stated that he was completely revoking any and all legal standing they falsely claimed to hold regarding my medical care, my personal estate, and my financial trusts. He looked directly at their expensive litigation attorney and warned him that he was dangerously close to being implicated in a massive federal crime. The lawyer immediately took 3 large steps away from Connor and Alyssa, actively and visibly distancing himself from his radioactive clients. The judge looked directly at my children and told them they were a profound disgrace to the concept of family. He said that in his 30 years on the bench, he had seen many ugly family disputes, but he had never witnessed such a vile, calculated, and heartless attempt to destroy a living parent for financial gain. He officially declared the forged power of attorney entirely null and void, and stated for the official record that all of my assets, including the $6.5 million blind trust, remained solely and completely under my absolute control. But the legal slaughter was not finished. Sterling Hayes had been preparing for this exact moment for weeks. He had not just gathered evidence to protect my money. He had specifically gathered evidence to ensure my children faced the maximum possible criminal penalties. Sterling turned to the judge and calmly stated that he had pre-coordinated this entire evidentiary presentation with the district attorney office. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open once again. 4 uniformed police officers, accompanied by 2 plainclothes detectives, marched purposefully down the center aisle. The heavy sound of their boots on the marble floor sounded like the beating drums of absolute karma. Connor and Alyssa turned their heads and saw the officers approaching. The last lingering shred of their arrogant corporate facades completely disintegrated. The lead detective stepped through the swinging wooden gate and walked directly up to the plaintiff table. He looked at my son and my daughter and loudly announced that they were officially under arrest. He listed the severe criminal charges in a loud, clear voice that echoed off the high ceiling. Grand theft, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, severe elder financial abuse. Each word was a heavy iron nail sealing the coffin of their greedy, entitled lives. The police officers moved in and grabbed Connor by his arms. My son completely lost his mind. He started screaming and thrashing against the officers, struggling violently as they pulled his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most definitive sound I had ever heard. Connor desperately looked around the room, his eyes wild with terror. He looked at Alyssa and began screaming at the top of his lungs, blaming her for the entire scheme. He yelled that it was her idea to sell the house quickly, and that she was the one who found the corrupt notary. Alyssa reacted with pure vicious panic. As the officers grabbed her arms and snapped the cold steel handcuffs around her own wrists, she screamed right back at her brother. She sobbed hysterically, shouting that Connor was the one who forged the signature, and that he was the one who pushed them to file the fake missing persons report. They stood in the middle of the courtroom, completely turning on each other like cornered rats, entirely willing to tear each other apart to save their own skin. I watched this pathetic, disgusting display of mutual betrayal with a completely stone-cold expression. I stood perfectly still, leaning on my heavy oak cane, feeling the dull, burning ache in my shattered right leg. I looked at the 2 people I had created, the 2 people I had sacrificed my entire life to protect and provide for. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal pity. I looked for a single drop of sorrow or regret, but I found absolutely nothing. The deep, burning love I used to hold for my children had been completely, entirely extinguished the very night they left me to suffocate in that dark hospital room. As the police officers forcefully dragged Connor and Alyssa down the center aisle toward the heavy courtroom doors, they both turned their heads and looked directly at me. Their faces were red, and streaked with mascara and tears. They were begging me with their eyes, pleading for me to intervene. They wanted their father to step in and save them from the consequences of their own monstrous actions, just like I had always done when they were children. But I was no longer their safety net. I did not say a single word. I did not blink. I simply stared back at them with absolute unyielding iron resolve. I watched them being hauled out of the courtroom, their desperate screams echoing down the marble hallway, until the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off their voices completely. The silence returned to the courtroom. The judge looked down at me from his elevated bench, giving me a slow, respectful nod of profound understanding. Tom placed his massive hand firmly on my shoulder, giving it a strong, reassuring squeeze. Sterling Hayes quietly began packing his thick folders back into his heavy leather briefcase, the brutal legal slaughter flawlessly perfectly executed. I stood in the center of the quiet room, feeling an incredible profound sense of absolute liberation. The crushing weight of the past 40 years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The toxic, greedy leeches that had attached themselves to my life were completely, permanently gone. The ties of blood were officially severed forever. I was a retired diesel mechanic with a shattered leg and a battered body, but I had never felt stronger in my entire life. I had completely protected my legacy. I had delivered absolute righteous justice. And as I slowly turned and walked out of that courtroom, leaning heavily on my solid oak cane, I knew with absolute certainty that the rest of my days belonged entirely to me. Exactly 1 year has passed since the heavy oak doors of the county courthouse slammed shut behind my screaming children. The cold autumn rain that washed over Columbus on the day of their arrest has long since faded away. It has been replaced by the crisp, golden sunlight of a brand new October. Time is an incredibly peculiar thing when you have survived the absolute worst emotional betrayal imaginable. It moves incredibly slowly at first, dragging painfully through the endless days of tedious legal paperwork and exhausting court testimonies. Then it suddenly accelerates, leaving you standing in the quiet, peaceful aftermath of a vicious war you never actually wanted to fight. Connor and Alyssa are currently serving significant sentences in a maximum security state prison. The ruthless legal trap that Sterling Hayes built around them held up flawlessly under the crushing heavy weight of the federal justice system. The high-definition video footage from the coffee shop sting operation and the undeniable forensic evidence of the forged medical proxy left their highly expensive defense attorneys with absolutely no maneuvering room whatsoever. My children were completely cornered by the undeniable consequences of their own bottomless arrogance. During the official sentencing phase of their criminal trial, they tried absolutely everything to secure a measure of leniency from the judge. They cried genuine tears of absolute sheer terror as the magistrate handed down their respective consecutive sentences for grand theft and forgery and severe elder financial abuse. Their polished, shiny corporate reputations were instantly and completely obliterated by the local media coverage. Connor lost his prestigious executive position at his firm. He lost his highly coveted country club membership, and his expensive luxury vehicle was repossessed. His wealthy, influential friends immediately abandoned him the very second the local news published the sordid graphic details of his disgusting crime. Alyssa lost her professional real estate license, permanently facing massive, crippling civil penalties on top of her criminal prison sentence. The imported Italian marble kitchen countertops she was so incredibly desperate to pay for were violently ripped out by angry, unpaid contractors, and her comfortable, beautiful suburban life completely dissolved into absolute ash. They sit in cold, damp concrete cells today, stripped entirely of their expensive designer clothes and their unearned lifelong entitlement. They are left with absolutely nothing but the hollow, haunting echo of their own catastrophic, unchecked greed. Sometimes I sit quietly on the rustic front porch of Tom Rural Cabin, and I look out at the dense green tree line, wondering if my children ever pause to think about the exact moment they stood in my sterile hospital room and casually priced my beating heart against their trivial hollow status symbols. I do not feel any sense of joyous celebration at their grim incarceration. I do not throw loud parties to mark their steep, dramatic downfall. A father never truly rejoices in the utter physical and social destruction of his own flesh and blood. But I do feel a profound, unshakable, incredible peace settling deep into my weary bones. The toxic, greedy leeches that had forcefully attached themselves to my life and drained my generous spirit for decades are permanently, definitively gone. The agonizing sharp pain in my shattered right femur has slowly faded to a dull, manageable ache, serving as a daily physical reminder that I survived the absolute worst they could possibly throw at me. With my criminal children legally and physically removed from my daily life, I was left to finally deal with the staggering heavy reality of the $6.5 million blind trust. The massive corporate technology buyout of my barren commercial dirt lot had miraculously transformed my modest, quiet existence into a realm of unimaginable, boundless wealth. But after you have looked the grim reaper directly in the face, and after you have heard your own biological children calculate the exact monetary value of your sudden tragic demise, money quickly loses its typical shiny, superficial appeal. I realized very rapidly that keeping millions of dollars sitting completely idle in a secure digital bank account was a total waste of the incredible, miraculous second chance I had been graciously granted. I did not want to buy a massive, sprawling mansion or a shiny fleet of ridiculously expensive sports cars. I am merely a retired, heavy diesel mechanic who spent 40 long, grueling years busting my tired knuckles in freezing cold garages, and I am perfectly, deeply content with the simple, quiet comforts of an ordinary life. So I sat down at a polished conference table with Sterling Hayes and my private executive wealth management team, and we built a completely different kind of lasting fortress. We formally established a highly secure, completely anonymous charitable medical trust fund. We partnered directly with the exact same metropolitan hospital where my children had so casually left me to suffocate in the terrifying dark. I named this new charitable foundation the Evelyn Blake Memorial Trust, deliberately honoring the true, magnificent love of my life and the wonderful woman whose precious memory they had so disgustingly weaponized with their forged, fraudulent power of attorney. The explicit, dedicated purpose of this massive financial trust is to silently and immediately step in to completely pay for the life-saving surgical procedures and critical intensive care treatments for vulnerable elderly patients whose families absolutely cannot afford the crushing, debilitating medical debt. We also specifically target patients whose selfish families simply refuse to pay for their ongoing, necessary recovery. Every single month, the hospital administration securely and privately sends a detailed list of vulnerable, critically injured senior citizens directly to my trust managers. We carefully review their individual medical cases, and we quietly, completely clear their entire looming financial burden. The recovering patients never, ever know my real name. They never know exactly where the massive influx of money came from. They simply wake up from their difficult, dangerous operations to find that their massive, terrifying hospital bills have been entirely miraculously erased by a silent, anonymous benefactor. I desperately wanted to ensure that absolutely no other elderly person ever had to lie physically paralyzed in a cold hospital bed, listening helplessly to their own relatives debate whether their precious life was actually worth the financial investment of a standard medical recovery. Over the past 12 beautiful months, the Evelyn Blake Memorial Trust has fully and completely funded over 40 major complex surgeries. We have successfully saved frail grandfathers who urgently needed emergency cardiac bypasses, and we have rescued sweet grandmothers who desperately required complex, extensive spinal fusions exactly like mine. I took the exact massive fortune that Connor and Alyssa actively tried to steal to fund their shallow, superficial luxury vacations, and I permanently weaponized that boundless wealth to literally save innocent, fragile human lives. Every single time, my dedicated trust administrator calls me to happily report that another elderly patient is safely going home to a loving, truly grateful family, I can literally feel the broken, shattered pieces of my tired heart stitch themselves back together. My children foolishly tried to use my temporary physical vulnerability to completely destroy my life. But in doing so, they inadvertently triggered a massive, unstoppable wave of anonymous grace that will continue to directly help desperate, terrified strangers long after my physical body is permanently gone. On the exact 1-year anniversary of my miraculous, terrifying survival, I asked Tom to drive me down to the quiet, peaceful, shaded cemetery located on the far eastern edge of the county limit. The autumn morning air was incredibly crisp and wonderfully clear, creating a stark, beautiful contrast to the heavy, oppressive rain that had plagued the difficult days of my early medical recovery. We pulled slowly through the tall, wrought iron cemetery gates and parked the truck carefully near a massive ancient oak tree, whose thick, sprawling branches cast long, protective, calming shadows over the perfectly manicured green grass. I slowly stepped out of the passenger side of the truck, leaning firmly and confidently on the solid oak cane Tom had personally carved for me. My damaged leg ached with a familiar cold weather stiffness, but I walked forward with my spine perfectly straight and my head held incredibly high. Tom walked silently and respectfully by my side, serving as an absolute steady pillar of true brotherly strength and completely unwavering familial loyalty. We stopped walking and stood completely still in front of Evelyn's smooth, polished granite headstone. I stood there, in the quiet morning breeze, for a very long time, simply looking down at the beautifully carved letters spelling out her precious name. I thought deeply about the incredible, unpredictable, terrifying journey of the past 12 turbulent months. I realized standing right there, in the peaceful silence, that karma is an absolutely flawless, infinitely patient master architect. Karma does not ever rush its work, and it absolutely never makes a single mistake. My children had eagerly and happily planted the dark seeds of their own absolute destruction the very moment they decided my continued life was a financial inconvenience. They had dug a deep, treacherous, invisible pit for me to fall into, completely unaware that they were actually digging their own permanent concrete prison cells. I looked over at Tom, who was respectfully holding his faded cap in his large, rough hands, and I felt a massive, overwhelming surge of pure, unfiltered, genuine gratitude. Tom was not technically related to me by blood, but he had stood firmly by my side and protected my life when my own biological children had cowardly left me to die alone. I realized with absolute stunning clarity that the true defining meaning of family has absolutely nothing to do with shared genetics or standard legal birth certificates. True family is solely defined by the brave people who stand with you in the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments of your entire life. True family is the loyal person who places a hidden security camera in a dangerous hospital room to protect your blind spots from predators. True family is the steadfast person who actively drives you to a secure rural safe house and carves you a solid wooden cane so you can finally stand up and face your terrifying monsters. I looked back down at Evelyn's beautiful resting place, and I spoke to her out loud in the crisp morning air. I told her that our greedy children were gone permanently lost to a terrible consuming sickness of the human soul that absolutely no amount of money could ever possibly cure. I told her that I had deeply mourned their tragic loss, but that I was absolutely no longer crying over their selfish choices. I told my beautiful late wife that I had taken the absolute worst, most profound, agonizing betrayal a loving father could ever possibly experience, and I had completely successfully transformed it into a glowing, permanent legacy of genuine life-saving kindness for complete innocent strangers. I told her that I had painfully lost my biological family, but I had miraculously completely saved my own eternal soul in the difficult, grueling process. The morning wind blew softly and gently through the ancient oak branches, carrying away the very last heavy, lingering remnants of my paternal grief. I bent down slowly and placed a beautiful fresh bouquet of vibrant yellow roses directly against the cold, solid granite stone, feeling an absolute, unshakable, profound peace settle permanently into my tired, weary bones. Blood merely makes you biologically related to another human being, but unyielding loyalty, profound daily sacrifice, and true unwavering unconditional love are the absolute only fundamental things that truly make you a family. You must never, ever make the foolish, tragic mistake of confusing a quiet, older man, peaceful, stoic silence for physical frailty or mental weakness. Those of us who have spent our entire, long, arduous lives quietly building the vast physical world around us with our own two calloused, battered hands, possess a deep, hidden well of internal strength and absolute iron resolve that arrogant, greedy, entitled minds can never ever possibly begin to comprehend. We know exactly how to silently, gracefully endure the burning, excruciating pain of a shattered, broken bone, and we know exactly how to patiently, intelligently wait for the absolutely perfect moment to strike back against the wicked forces that try to destroy us. Pure, unchecked, endless greed will always eventually blind the wicked, pushing them relentlessly to cross terrible, dangerous moral lines they can never possibly uncross, and karma will always inevitably arrive precisely on time to collect its heavy, devastating, permanent toll. I walked away from the terrifying, cold brink of inevitable death, not just to barely survive the horrific ordeal, but to completely and powerfully rewrite the final triumphant ending of my own personal life story. I took the bitter, deadly, toxic poison my own children maliciously poured into my vulnerable life, and I miraculously turned it into healing, saving medicine for the forgotten, the elderly, and the weak. That is the true ultimate victory against human evil. That is the absolute only lasting, meaningful legacy that actually truly matters in this beautiful, complicated, highly unpredictable world we all share together. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to comment your current location and time. See you in the next life story with love and respect.